Tim, are you in the audience? I just want to do a sound check to make sure everyone can hear me and I can hear you.
Jen, I hear you well.
Yep, you're working good.
I just put a message in chat for participants who may be in the Teams meeting. Is anybody able to hear me right now? Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it. No.
Can you hear me now, Jen?
Yes, now I can hear you. I think that was Tim. Is that right?
That was Chris.
Oh, Chris. Okay, sorry.
Yep.
I got the now part. That was it. Okay, thank you for letting me know.
That's all right.
Yep. All right. Do you need anything else from me? If not, I'm just going to get my slides ready to share, but I think the sound check's good. Thanks.
Nope, we're all set.
For it, but the lowest I'll take is $675. So what do you know about Nipper? Nipper was a trademark of the Victor Talking Machine Company before 1900. Yeah, Nipper.
Alan, we can hear you too. Yeah, okay.
Yes, I can hear you.
Good morning, everybody. Gonna wait a couple more minutes. We're waiting on a few more people, and then we'll get started. All right, good morning. It looks like just about everybody's on. Welcome back to Boot Camp Basic Day 2. We have one more in April after our in-person event. We're going to start this morning with an introduction to cropland conservation with Jen Weld. Jen, if you are ready, you can share your screen and we can get started.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. And let me move to the top of the presentation. I'm already at the end, which might be exciting for some of you that we start at the end. Okay, so this morning, and I'm glad to be back joining you again. We talked about soil basics last week, and now we're just going to go over the introduction to some cropland conservation, looking at some different practices that are commonly used that you may be seeing or have seen or will see in Pennsylvania. So again, my name is Jennifer Weld. I work with Penn State, and this presentation was prepared by Tyson Myers, who is with USDA NRCS. So before we start looking at some of the practices that are used across the landscape in Pennsylvania, it's important to consider some of the common cropland resources concerns associated with soil health, but also that's directly tied with erosion. We see a picture of gully or an image here of gully erosion, some pretty significant gully erosion in a field. So with soil health, we really want to be concerned with depleting organic matter. That speaks to the ability of the soil to support plants. Also, water management. Organic matter is very important in water management as well. It helps with compaction, helps to prevent compaction, because if we have more organic matter in the soil, we have better aggregate stability, meaning we have a better soil structure. And soil organisms, when we talked about soil basics, one role or function of a soil is, the habitat for our soil, both micro and macroorganisms. So we want to maintain our soil health, maintain our soil organic matter, and that's one of our cropland resource concerns, is maintaining the soil health. And to do that, we need to, one piece that comes into play is preventing erosion. And there's different types of erosion that can occur. They're estimated in different ways, and they appear in a conservation plan in different parts of the plan. But one goal is with controlling the erosion is to control or maintain improved soil health. So we see here on the right-hand side an image of gully erosion. This happens typically when you have concentrated flow that is untreated. This is an example of a classic gully. This is a pretty severe example. At this point, the landscape and the way the water moves across the landscape has been permanently changed. This field is changed permanently, and there's going to need to be some sort of intervention with construction to repair this. There are also forms of erosion, sheet and rill erosion. And for those of you who may be familiar with conservation planning or possibly agricultural erosion and sediment control planning, you often hear of estimating soil loss using Russell or Russell 2, tolerable soil loss, actual soil loss. And a lot of those terms and estimation processes apply to sheet and rill erosion. So this landscape here, you can see examples of rill erosion, which is going to occur in these shallow channels that kind of cross the landscape. They're not permanent channels. This is a permanent channel. These would be kind of intermittent channels. They're going to appear in different locations across a field, depending on the intensity of the storm. From year to year, it can vary depending on how crops are changing in a field. Sheet erosion occurs as a uniform movement of water across the landscape. It's usually driven by rainfall, and we usually discuss sheet and rill erosion together, right? And separate from gully erosion. So the practices we're going to be looking at today, for the most part, are located in the electronic field office technical guide. Actually, all of the practices plus more are in the electronic field office technical guide, but there's also a conservation catalog that's a nice resource as you're beginning to work with these different practices and start discussions with farmers, land managers, and landowners about how to use conservation practices, to work with their land, achieve their management goals. So best management practices, or typically what's referred to as BMPs, you'll hear that word a lot in soil conservation, are practices that are used either individually or in combination as a system to address resource concerns on cropland. There can be multiple resource concerns on the cropland. It just doesn't have to be one concern. Typically, we look at issues associated with erosion, maintaining and improving soil health, but there can be other resource concerns depending on the management goals and the land use for the particular landowner or farmer. So we're going to step through a few common practices that you may see, look at some of the purposes. Now, the purposes for that are going to be listed here would be the purposes that you would also see in the practice standard, and the practice standard is what is located in the electronic field office technical guide, often known as EFOTOG. That's usually how I refer to it. And these purposes help direct why you're using this particular practice. What resource concern are you addressing? If you're looking at using systems or combinations of practices, understanding how to read a practice standard and how the purposes kind of work together is very important. And this is where Those most familiar with reading and using practice standards are wonderful resources, such as specifically NRCS, as well as your conservation districts. So conservation crop rotation is essentially a sequence of crops that are grown. It's located in the same fields or the same sequence of fields over a period of time. Some of the purposes of using a conservation crop rotation: reducing sheet and rill erosion, and maintaining soil health by maintaining or increasing soil organic matter. This allows, with the increase or maintaining soil organic matter, allows those particular fields and those soils to have better soil moisture use efficiency. And you can also reduce both the rate of movement of surface runoff and also what that surface runoff is carrying from the field to water bodies, so such as salts and chemicals, nutrients. From an agronomic standpoint, or probably a crop management standpoint, you can reduce the pressures from different types of pests, as well as weed pressures, by using conservation crop rotation. It also allows, if you're working with an operation that relies on their crops to maintain a feed inventory, specifically dairy farms, using conservation crop rotation is very important for maintaining their field and forage inventories. And another purpose, this particular crop BMP or practice has a lot of different purposes. It can achieve a lot of different goals. Is it does provide habitat for wildlife, including pollinators. And that's one, we didn't talk about that resource concern at the beginning, but that's another important piece to some of these practices. So this is an example of what a crop rotation would look like across different fields. This upper left-hand picture is a very good illustration. You can see the different crops occurring in sequence. And some common crop rotations you may see in Pennsylvania include corn, grain, and soybeans, also corn silage, small grains, alfalfa, and hay. Dairy operations, you'll often see a small grain silage following corn, for example. And again, that speaks to their need to maintain their feed inventories. So contour farming, as we move on to our next practice, is very important. And when we talk about contour farming, that is where you are aligning farming practices with the land. So you're working with the land when you have your farming practices, and that may be tillage or planting, are going to form different features on the field, such as furrows and ridges, and change the roughness of the soil. And when you're able to do that and work with kind of the contour and the grade of the natural contour grade of the field, you have the ability to reduce the velocity of surface runoff that may be moving across the field, and also the direction. You're allowing that water to move more in the natural direction. So here we're looking at some of the similar resource concerns, such as reducing sheet and rill erosion, which in turn reduces the sediment transport and nutrients to surface waters, pesticide transport, but again, going back to that, maintaining or improving the efficiency of moisture for the crops. So this is kind of those farming practices and the features that naturally occur on the field because of the farming practices working with the grade of the land. And this is an example, two nice images of contour farming. And you can see these fields very nicely are placed with the contour here and also over here. So it kind of almost looks like a topographic map in some ways, with the contours on a topographic map. Again, allowing those farming practices to work with the land. Strip cropping. This is using different crops that are either erosion resistant or erosion susceptible in alternating fields. Or here's referred to as a systematic arrangement. That's probably a better term. Again, here you are taking crops that may have more susceptibility to sheet and rill erosion, and those that are less susceptible, maybe forage crops, for example, and controlling how the runoff and subsequently sediment and nutrients move across the land and subsequently into water bodies. This also allows for improved plant productivity. You're keeping the soil in place, you're keeping the nutrients in place. And it's not unusual to see strip cropping and contour farming working together. right? So you're working with the land, and then you're in turn using an arrangement of erosion susceptible and erosion resistant crops to even further work with or manage how the water and subsequently nutrients and sediment are moving across the land. Oops. So this is, again, some images, not on the contour here. Well, it could be on the contour depending on where we are in the country, but some good examples of using erosion susceptible and erosion resistant, such as forages and possibly maybe small grains in an arrangement across the field. Here we see corn and we see oats, and then we see hay. So we have examples of our erosion resistant and our erosion susceptible crops. So cover crops. Cover crops are a very common best management practice, and they can include leguminous crops, they can include grasses, they can include forbs. Examples of forbs might be clovers or possibly sunflowers, milkweed, in combination or alone to provide vegetated cover for different seasons. Typically, it's the fall into the winter. In some systems, those cover crops are harvested, and for example, for small grain silage, again, that speaks to the management objectives of that farm and the need to maintain feed inventories. But overall, cover crops keep the ground covered. They reduce erosion. Here we have wind erosion more broadly. They definitely address wind erosion, which is more common in different parts of the country, as well as water erosion, whether it's sheet and rill or gully erosion. We're maintaining and increasing the soil health, right? We have more root activity, plant activity year round. So you're going to have more organic matter content, possibly maintaining that soil structure. You're also going to be able to utilize soil nutrients by those cover crops taking the soil nutrients up. And we have the ability to reduce weed pressures and start to break pest cycles. So that's another important piece of cover crops. These are some examples of cover crops. Here we have a very interesting cover crop, tillage radishes. We see them up here. This particular cover crop is often used, or one of its purposes is reducing compaction. In general, cover crops can reduce compaction. Tillage radishes specifically have the ability, because of the way they grow, and subsequently when they die and decay, they leave basically openings where these tubers are in the soil, and that has the ability to break through compaction that may be occurring at the surface, maybe within that first 6 inches, kind of a plow pan. So cover crops also have that particular function as well. So residue management and tillage management. In this case, we're talking about no-till. So residue management and tillage management is very important. You're limiting the amount of soil disturbance, and this allows you to manage the residue across the field. So you have more uniform residue across the field. From an erosion standpoint, specifically sheet and rill erosion, residue is extremely important because it intercepts raindrops and it prevents that raindrop impact from detaching the soil, which is what starts the erosion process, right? So if you can minimize that soil detachment through covering the soil, in this case through residue management, that can help minimize sheet and rill erosion and subsequently the amount of soil and nutrients that are moved from a field into a water body. In this case, it also can reduce particulate emissions. We're moving into a slightly different purpose than we've discussed before. And we're maintaining soil health, potentially increasing the organic matter. Again, we're keeping that soil in place. We're keeping those nutrients in place. When we talk about no-till, specifically, we're looking at possibly reduced energy use across the farm. That's another purpose why this particular practice is used. And again, we're kind of looking at kind of habitat shelter for wildlife when you have residue management in place and more residue in place on a field. So this is an example of what residue might look like in a no-till situation. You can see most of the ground is covered. Here, the plants are at a different stage of growth, and you can see there's definitely cover. And when we look at the operations themselves, you can see there's minimal disturbance. So you can also practice or have a practice associated with residue and tillage management in reduced till situations. There's going to be more disturbance than no-till, so some of the purposes are going to be a little bit different. You can see we don't have the purpose associated with wildlife habitat because of the reduced amount of residue that's left. But with reduced till, again, you're trying to manage the residue, manage how the soil is being covered year round, and minimizing soil disturbance during typical farming activities. And a lot of the purposes are very similar, such as reducing soil loss, and that in turn reduces the amount of sediment and nutrients that are transported. And we're here also have the reduction in the particle emissions and increasing soil health. So here we're looking at reduced till, and you can see this image is very similar to this particular image. It's a little bit different, but it's showing a similar scenario. And you can see there is still quite a bit of cover, but there's less than there is with no-till. So we're achieving the same purpose, but maybe not at the same level. And you can see down here, there's a bit more disturbance as we look at reduced till as opposed to no-till. So nutrient management is also important when we talk about practices. This is a practice that is discussed a lot in the state of Pennsylvania, in the mid-Atlantic states, but in the country in general. How nutrient management is discussed really depends where you are in the country. We have a lot of concerns with both nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium as well, but when we speak about environmental concerns, we usually speak about nitrogen and phosphorus. Herd health concerns a little bit more related to that other macronutrient, the third macronutrient in nutrient management plans, potassium or potash. But if you move into kind of the Midwest states, especially in the Corn Belt area, there's often still more of an emphasis on nitrogen. They're landlocked. They don't have as much surface water, so there's different emphasis, but still we're working with the same nutrients and the same purposes. Which is really to manage where nutrients are being placed, what the rate is, what are the sources, and what are the timing, and how do we match that with achieving crop yields and management goals and the amendments and the sources of nutrients that are available on the farm, and also to reduce environmental impacts, right? How do you balance that? That's the practice of nutrient management. And there are a lot of purposes associated with nutrient management. We're definitely looking to have a productive and healthy crop. So plant health and productivity is important. Looking to reduce nutrients that are entering surface waters and groundwaters. We're again moving kind of into odors and particulate matter and greenhouse gases that are being emitted. And also pathogen reduction. When we look at the application of manures and biosolids, making sure that risk is minimized and if we're aware of what that risk might be. And again, looking at improving or maintaining soil organic matter. So nutrient management touches on a lot of different pieces, but really looking at managing that rate, source, and placement and timing, and balancing management goals, yield goals, with minimizing environmental impacts. So to do this, some common practices that we might see are soil testing, understanding what the nutrient status of the soil is, manure testing or amendment testing, understanding what the nutrient content is that's being applied to that soil in order to achieve crop yields. So filter strips, we're going to go in a little bit of a different direction, away from nutrient management. Filter strips are very commonly used. It's herbaceous vegetation. It's intended to remove contaminants from overland flow or surface runoff. It will reduce the amount of solids and any associated contaminants with those solids or just excessive sediment that's moving in surface waters. It also reduces the loadings associated with those sediments or contaminants from runoff. Oftentimes you'll see these in irrigation systems or just areas where there's going to be an excessive amount of loadings of contaminants or sediments that need to be given the opportunity to kind of settle out in this vegetated area. So this is very much discussing or related to how the water is moving across the land. This is two very nice examples of filter strips that are at the bottom of fields to kind of control the surface runoff, but also to allow sediment and associated contaminants to settle out. Grass waterway is different than a filter strip. That is a very much a designed, shaped, graded channel. It will have different types of vegetation depending on the type of concentrated flow area that is being addressed with this particular waterway. And the waterway is being designed specifically so that the velocity of the surface water through that grass waterway is non-erosive. They're usually broad and shallow, and they will kind of empty into a more stable outlet. Often, grass waterways can be used in combination with other practices, such as terraces and diversions, to prevent erosion from those particular areas. If there is a gully that is forming in a field, oftentimes a grass waterway will be used to prevent that gully from becoming incised in the way the first photograph was shown. And one of the purposes is also to protect and improve water quality, right? To allow the water and surface runoff to move in a way that is non-erosive. It also allows nutrients and sediment to settle out before it's reaching that stable outlet. So this is an example of a waterway at different stages of development. You can see here, the area where the waterway is being installed. You can start to see the beginnings of a gully. Then you can see it graded out. Here it is, probably right before it was seeded or just when it was seeded. And here you can see the grass waterway growing. So the type of grass waterway that's installed, how wide it is, the type of vegetation that's included is often very much determined by the type of concentrated flow or the reason that waterway is being installed. Here's another example. Here's a rock-lined waterway, and you can see the water is moving slowly through that rock-lined waterway. And over here is a waterway as well. So again, it's to maintain a non-erosive velocity through that particular waterway area. So diversion is another type of practice, and it is a channel as well. It's generally constructed across the slope, which is a little bit different than a waterway, and it has a ridge on the lower side. And oftentimes these are seen on longer slopes. It allows the slope to be broken up. That allows erosion, specifically sheet and rill erosion, to be reduced. Diversions can also be used to divert water away from, for example, terrace systems. We're going to look at those in a minute. But it can also be used. They can also be used to divert water away from farmsteads, agricultural waste systems. So they can be used to control how the water is moving around different structures or practices or other best management practices on the farm. If there is an area that's been identified as what's referred to here as a critically eroding area, or an area where you know that there is a gully that is emerging and that is forming, you can use diversions to divert the water away from those areas, prevent further erosion, and then combine that with another practice, possibly a grass waterway. Diversions are used in agricultural settings, but they're also used in mining sites as well as construction sites. So these particular practices can be seen in different types of land uses in addition to, or management systems, in addition to agricultural management systems. So diversions are a very useful best management practice. Yeah, they definitely break up the slope. They sometimes can be used where terracing can't be used, and we'll look at terracing in a moment, but they can also be used to protect areas and divert water away from structures or critical areas as well. So terraces, and I mentioned those, are a little bit different. They're earthen embankments, and they have a combination of a bridge and channel that's constructed across the field slope. And the idea here is to reduce and trap sediment, but also to manage runoff, where a diversion could be used for this purpose if it's breaking up a slope lane, but is also used kind of control how water is moving around different areas, and it could control how water moves into a terrace system to make sure that the terrace system can successfully meet its purpose of managing the runoff and reducing and trapping the sediment. So this is a nice example here in the bottom right-hand corner of a terrace system, kind of with the combination of the ridge and channel. Water and sediment basin control. These are earthen embankments. Again, they can also be a combination of a ridge and channel. They're, again, constructed across the slope like a diversion or a terrace system. And they are to reduce gully erosion, water erosion, trap sediment, and manage runoff. So that is what the sediment control basin is. The name is very descriptive of the purpose in this case, but you're really looking to trap the sediment and you're looking to manage the runoff. This is an example of a sediment control basin. Oops. Sorry about that. So that is the last practice that we're going to discuss this morning. Kind of end with the 3 practices that allow us to control runoff and sediment control. Those practices are very interesting, especially when they're used in combination with other practices or in the role of a diversion when you have identified a critical area on the landscape and you need to protect that as another practice, such as a grass waterway, is being installed, and possibly even long-term to make sure that a grass waterway or a terrace system is successful and can be properly maintained and is effective and functions across its lifespan. That's another piece that's important for best management practices is each practice has its own specific lifespan and also has maintenance requirements. So once the practice is installed, it does need to be maintained. It needs to be inspected. Grass waterways are a great example. They are designed specifically to have non-erosive velocities moving across the grass waterway, but you need to make sure that a channel is not developing within that grass waterway, right? Because the idea is the grass waterway is not supposed to have a concentrated flow, but it's supposed to have dispersed flow that moves slowly. So it's just one example of why maintenance is important, and oftentimes why you see combinations of practices in the field together to make sure that all of the practices are successful and can be properly maintained. So thank you very much for the time this morning. I very much appreciate it, and I will be around on the Teams meeting until noon if there are any questions. So thank you again.
All right, thank you so much. Does anybody have any questions right now that they'd like to ask? Raise your hand, or you put it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask. Okay, if not, we're going to continue on to an introduction to livestock with Jenny Christ.
Good morning, everyone. Everything look okay?
Everything looks good, Jenny. We can hear you fine and see your presentation.
Perfect. Great. Thank you so much. So hello, everyone. As Chris said, my name is Jenny Christ with Penn State Extension. I am going to give us an introduction to livestock this morning. And so, the first question we have to ask ourselves is, what is livestock, right? And so, of course, anytime I try to answer a question, I go to, my favorite search engine, Google, and type in my question, what is livestock? And so I got a few definitions to share with you. And so Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines livestock as animals kept or raised for use or pleasure, and especially farm animals kept for use and profit. So this is not a very specific example. And so then, I continue down the rabbit hole. And so Cambridge Dictionary says animals and birds that are kept on a farm, such as cows, sheep, or chickens. So these are both, very simplified definitions. And something else we have to consider is what does the government define livestock as? So our Code of Federal Regulations describes livestock as including cattle, sheep, horses, goats, and other domestic animals ordinarily raised or used on the farm. But turkeys or domesticated fowl are considered poultry and not livestock in this definition, which I thought was interesting that turkeys and other domesticated fowl are considered not livestock. So, of course, we've continued further down, the spiral, and we get to the Federal Motor Carriers Safety Administration definition of livestock, and that means cattle, elk, reindeer, bison, horses, deer, sheep, goat, swine, poultry, llamas, alpacas, live fish, crawfish, and other animals that are part of a foundation herd, including dairy producing cattle or offspring. And so again, just this one is a very diverse definition. There are things in their definition that I would not consider livestock, such as live fish or crawfish, but I thought that was a very interesting definition. And so lastly, I turned to good old Wikipedia. I think we all turn to Wikipedia sometimes when we're looking for answers. And so I found that Wikipedia had a really good kind of beginning to their definition of livestock, and that is domesticated animals raised in an agricultural setting in order to provide labor and produce diversified products for consumption, such as meat, eggs, milk, fur, leather, and wool. So I enjoyed that. And so for our use today, we are going to define livestock as domesticated animals used for the production of goods and services. And so in Pennsylvania, this is going to include, this is not an all-inclusive list. There are, of course, exceptions to every rule, right? But here we have a list of our most common types of livestock. So we have cattle, both beef and dairy, goats, horses, poultry, sheep, and swine. And so we are going to get into this with a nice little discussion about these groups of animals. So to start off with, let's talk about beef cattle. So our beef cattle main uses include meat, hide, which is leather and suede. That's how we find our beef hides in the market. And then a variety of different byproducts ranging from gelatin and glue to, pet food, to cosmetics, to manufacturing. So many different types of byproducts come from the beef cattle industry. And of course, all of the meat and milk products that we're going to talk about today are naturally gluten-free. Just thought I'd throw that out there for anybody that is looking for some sort of products that are naturally gluten-free. So when we think about beef cattle, they are ruminants. And so if you're not sure what that word means, ruminants are animals that have stomachs that are made of, they have stomachs. They have a stomach that has 4 compartments. And those 4 compartments are the rumen, the reticulum, the omasum, and the abomasum. It really does not matter that that they have those 4 parts and what they are called. But what's really important is that any ruminant animal has microbes in their ruminant that ferments the feed. And this is what allows them to utilize the energy very efficiently from our grasses and other forages. So cattle are unique in that they only have lower teeth in the front, and in the top, they have a tough dental pad. And so this makes them unique in the way that they eat. They use their tongue to bring the grass into their mouth, and then they gnaw it off. So cattle actually have pretty long tongues that they will reach out and kind of wrap around the forage or the grass and then gnaw it off and kind of rip it and pull it into their mouth. So they're going to prefer grass that's 6 to 10 inches tall, and their intake will decline when the grass height and density is decreased. So something just interesting to consider when, we are talking about livestock, is how they digest their food and what their nutrient needs are and the ways that they graze. And so when we think about beef cattle, we have a variety of different, categories and then standard weights associated with them. And so, the first thing we get whenever a baby is born, it is our calf. And so calves are typically considered a calf from 0 to 8 months old. And then a calf can become, different things. If it's destined for meat, to feed us and keep us healthy, then we're going to consider it a finishing animal. And so finishing animals can be steers or heifers. And so a steer is going to be a castrated male and a heifer is going to be a female. If you ever hear somebody talking about or using the word replacement heifer, that is a female that is being raised to become part of the permanent herd. She is not being raised for meat. She is not being finished out. She is being raised to become a reproductive member of the herd. Which brings us to the next one down, which is a cow. So of course, a cow is a female of the cattle or bovine group of animals. Sometimes we use cows as a general term to describe a group of cattle. And, you know, for the most part, that is pretty much accepted, you know, across the industry, is that we call them a group of cows. But, you know, cattle is really the technical term. And then a bull, of course, is a male that is being used for reproduction. And so you can see the list of standard weights there that are used when we are doing nutrient management planning and the ranges that are involved in those standard weights. And then just a few other key terms, things to consider when we're working with beef cattle. You might hear the word feeders. And so feeders are a little bit different than finishers or finishing that we talked about in the previous slide. So feeders are going to be animals that are raised from the time that they are weaned, so when they are no longer nursing off of their mother, until they're getting close to maturity, but they're not there yet and they're not quite ready. They need a few more months to you know, be ready to go to slaughter. And so feeders will be raised and then sold to a finisher. So somebody that's going to, you know, feed that animal out then for market. We'll also hear the term cow-calf pairs. And so this is any cow that has had a baby and she is still nursing that baby. We will classify those as cow-calf pairs. So sometimes a producer will say, you know, I have an operation of 25 cow-calf pairs and a bull and 30 finishers. And so you'll know that they, you know, have 25 reproducing cows and that they've had babies successfully, and so they are operating with 25 cow-calf pairs that are still together because those babies haven't been weaned yet, which again is the term for when the cow stops nursing her calf. You might also hear the word crossbred, and so crossbred is, you know, pretty much what it sounds like. It's when we've taken two or more breeds of cattle and we have combined them together into a, you know, a combination where we're really picking out those genetic factors that make the livestock most successful at, you know, putting on that meat as quickly as possible and as safely as possible. So we'll pick out the ones that are really good at that and combine them together into a crossbred. Two different types of operations you may hear about are grass-fed beef. So that's maybe more of a marketing term, but we'll use that when the cattle have been primarily fed grass their whole life, that their main diet their whole life was grass, whether that's pasture or hay, but they've received minimal grain throughout their growing life cycle. And then grass finished would be animals that, you know, maybe spent those feeder months, consuming grain, but those last months of their life before they were ready to go to market were only on grass. And then we'll hear the word feedlot sometimes. And so a feedlot is going to be a group of cows that are being finished out for market. They can be, you know, again, steers or heifers that are being finished out. They are typically not on pasture if they are in what's considered a feedlot. It's going to be some sort of confined area, and I don't mean confined like in a closed-in barn. It could be an open feedlot, but they're going to be, you know, in an area where all of their food and water needs are provided to them. They have room to move around, but they are not out grazing on pasture. So moving on, let's talk about dairy cows or dairy cattle. And so our main uses, of course, with our dairy are going to be milk, veal, and then meat. And so dairy cows, we get our milk from our female dairy cows. And so anytime, you know, a male calf is born, That calf is sometimes sent to the veal market. So that would be, an animal that's slaughtered at a younger age. Or it may be sent to a dairy beef operation. And this is where those male calves are turned into steers. So again, they're castrated and then they are raised out for beef as a dairy animal. They are raised out as dairy beef. And so we, again, our dairy cattle can provide us mostly with milk. That's their primary goal in life. But then we also get veal and beef meat out of them too. So again, their anatomy is going to be the same as beef cows. They are those ruminants. They're very good at taking forages and grasses and getting those nutrients out of them very efficiently. But dairy cows have a different body type than our beef cattle. They're going to be typically taller and leaner than beef. They're more streamlined almost. And so if you've been looking at beef cattle a lot and then you show up at a dairy, you might be a little confused. You might be thinking, man, they look a little skinny, but these animals just have a different body type because they're using their nutrients to produce milk instead of to put on meat for beef. And when we think about standard weights, we have a variety of different standard weights based on breed size. And so, we have all different types of breeds across the dairy and the beef cattle industries, but we've kind of classified the top 5 breeds here in our standard weights. And so the Holsteins and the Brown Swiss are going to be the largest animals. And so this is an example of a Holstein cow. They are very typical black and white. There are some red and white Holsteins, but typically the majority of Holsteins are going to be that black and white. And again, they're going to be tall, fairly large animals. And then we get into the Guernseys and the Ayrshires. So they are a little bit of a smaller, less tall animal, still very large, more in that brown and white combination. Again, color variation is very large across the cattle industry, but our Guernseys and our Ayrshires are going to be more of a brown and white color. And then finally, the smallest breed, and some people will say the best breed. I have friends that have Jersey herds and they just absolutely think Jerseys are the best cows ever. And I could go any way. I just love animals in general. So Jerseys are going to be much smaller than our Guernsey Ayrshires and our Holstein and Brown Swiss. And so I tried to pick pictures that might demonstrate the differences. Of course, I realize these are 2 different men, but you can still see where the Guernsey Ayrshire is, her head is above at that shoulder or even higher than the gentleman that is walking her, and where the Jerseys are all much shorter than the man in this other picture. So again, not the best comparison, but trying to just show the difference in the size between the Guernsey Ayrshires and the Jerseys. So some other terms to think about when we talk about dairy cattle, you might hear the word tie stall. So a tie stall is a type of barn where each cow is tied in her own individual stall. So each cow has their own individual space in that tie stall facility. Additionally, another option would be a freestall barn. And so a freestall barn is going to be a larger, more open type of a barn. The individual is going to have, each cow's going to have some space to lay down. There's going to be some walkways. They're also going to have access to food and water, but they're going to be managed as a large group, where sometimes in tie stalls, each cow is going to be fed maybe her own specific variation of a diet to meet her production goals. In a freestall, they're all going to be fed the same diet for that group. And so farmers may have multiple groups within their freestall barn. You may also hear the term first calf heifer. And so first calf heifer is used to describe a heifer who has had her first baby. It literally is her first calf. We normally use heifer to describe animals that haven't had babies yet, but in the dairy industry, we call, that heifer that has had her first baby, a first calf heifer, because she's going to be managed differently than individuals that have had multiple calves. Her milk production needs are different. She's not producing as much because she's still trying to, finish out growing her body and develop her milk production. So she's going to be fed a little bit differently and just managed differently altogether. And then 2 acronyms you may hear are AI and ET. And so, AI and ET can mean so many different things across so many different industries. But, when we're talking about cattle, AI is going to stand for artificial insemination. And so a lot of times, dairy farmers are using artificial insemination to breed their females, really for safety and, safety reasons. Because if you keep a bull at the farm, he can be aggressive towards the workers, towards the other animals. And when a lot of times in our dairy herds, our females are constantly having calves, so they're constantly going into heat. So there's just a lot of activity, and sometimes for safety reasons, it's just more economical and safe to use artificial insemination. And then ET stands for embryo transfer. So if you've got a cow that's got, wonderful genetics, great milk producer, you can, work with the vet to have her produce multiple embryos, and then they'll flush those embryos out and then put them into other cows. So you get some more superior genetics in your calves. And then milking parlor, sometimes just referred to as parlor. And so that's that picture here on the slide is our milking parlor. And so milking parlors come in all different shapes and sizes. This one here, the cows would come in from the back, the direction that the photographer is facing away from. The photographer's back is where the cattle would enter into that picture, and they would, line up single file. Each would be attached to a milking machine. And then once that whole row is done, they would be left to go back to their freestall barn. Parlors can also be circular in nature. And you can even milk in a tie stall where you would carry the milking unit from cow to cow in that tie stall. So moving on, we are going to talk about goats. And so the main use for goats here in, the United States and Pennsylvania is meat, milk, and fiber, but also weed control. So goats and sheep are, becoming fairly hot in invasive species or other types of, vegetation management control. And so this picture here is of a dairy goat. You can see by her large udder and her more streamlined body shape that is her main production goal. Goats are also ruminants, but they're different than our cattle. So they actually have upper and lower teeth, and they're going to eat individual leaves off of plants. And so they have thin little lips, and they'll actually kind of go around and they'll pick out exactly what leaves they want to eat off of the plants. So they're a little more particular about what they're going to eat, but they will eat a lot of different, variety of plants. And goats are unique out of all of our livestock because they will actually eat above their head. They'll stand up on their hind legs like this goat is doing in this picture and, reach for those nice, tasty leaves that are above their head. So when we think about standard goat weights, we separate our meat and our dairy animals. Again, our meat animals are going to weigh more than our dairy animals. And so a kid is going to be a baby goat. That's the word that we use to describe baby goats. And so one of my favorite signs to see along the road is when, a farm, somebody puts out kids for sale. And I laugh because I realize they're selling baby goats, but maybe other people think they're just tired of their family. So a doe is going to be a female goat and a buck is going to be a male. And so, of course, the bucks are always a little bit heavier than the females. And then, of course, that kind of brings me to my additional key term, is wether. And so a wether is going to be a castrated goat. So if you hear somebody talking about a group of wethers, that just means that they are, those goats are castrated. So moving on to horses. Our main uses for horses include recreation, competition, and work. And so you can see in this image here, this horse is kind of doing a little bit of everything. We might be watching it race as a form of recreation. The rider is competing in a competition and the horse is doing some work. So we get a little bit of everything here in this image. So horses are different. They are not ruminants. They are closer to monogastrics like us, but they have what's called a hindgut fermenter system. And so towards the end of their digestive system, they have an area where they are able to ferment the grasses and the forages for utilization of those nutrient needs. And so horses do have upper and lower teeth. Horses are able to eat grass very close to the ground, and so that makes them very extremely hard on pasture. And so a lot of times our horse owners will struggle with pasture management only because the horses themselves are really good at eating that grass very close to the ground. When we think about the diversity across the horse industry, they range from miniature horses, very small animals, up to draft horses, which are very large animals. And so a foal is going to be a baby horse. And then we get into a weanling. So this would be an animal that has been weaned from its mother, but, still a baby and still growing. Then we end up with yearlings, 2-year-olds, and mature animals, which are over 3 years of age. And so something I wanted to mention was the word pony. So a lot of times ponies are used to describe young animals, but in reality, a pony is a classification based on size. And so ponies are going to be, bigger than miniature horses, but smaller than an actual horse at maturity. So if they, don't meet that height threshold at maturity, they would be classified as a pony. Some additional key terms to consider would be a colt, which is a baby boy foal. So a baby foal that's a boy would be a colt. A baby girl, a baby foal that is a girl would be considered a filly. A mare is going to be a mature female. A stallion is going to be a mature male. A gelding is a castrated male. And so a lot of times geldings are going to be used for work or trail riding, various other types of recreation and even sport, but they of course are not used for breeding. And then you may hear the word boarding or board. And so this would be an individual that has a barn and they keep a variety of different horses for people based on, because they have the space and people rent that space, their horse gets, some care, and then people are able to have a horse if they don't have their own property to, or space to keep a horse. So they would board that horse at somebody else's place. Moving on to poultry. So our main uses, of course, with poultry are eggs and meat, but also feathers are used, again, for a variety of different purposes. And so poultry are classified as modified monogastrics, so they don't have any teeth and they have some, interesting parts to their digestive system, which we're not really going to get into. It's not that important, but what's interesting is when we do put poultry out on pasture, they're not eating grass. Poultry do not graze. They are feeding on insects and seeds. And so poultry will need supplemental feed to meet their nutritional needs if they are out on pasture. The poultry industry in Pennsylvania is very diverse. So we have chickens that are considered layers. So these are going to be chicken breeds that are raised for eggs. And then we have chickens that are considered broilers. So these are chickens that are going to be raised for meat. Then we have turkeys and ducks and a variety of different game birds that are also raised commercially here in Pennsylvania. And so you can see the variety in weights across, different types of chickens, from baby chicks up to mature breeders. You can just see that variety in weight and categories. And so you can see I have options listed there that when you check out the standard weights form, you will see that under laying chickens, there are 10 different options based on age, breed, and purpose. And so just a few other terms to consider when we're thinking about poultry. A pullet is going to be a female chicken under 12 months of age, and a cockerel is a male chicken under 12 months of age. And I'll admit that a cockerel is not a word that I even knew about existed in, the vocabulary of poultry. So that was something that I learned preparing this presentation. A capon is going to be a castrated male chicken that's being raised for meat. A broiler or a fryer. So I talked about broilers in the previous slide, but that may also be called a fryer. And so that's going to be a young meat bird that is either male or female, and it's typically butchered around 4 to 8 weeks of age for food. And then a pullet is going to be a baby turkey. So it's a young turkey. Before you can determine what type, if that's a male or a female turkey, it's going to be called a pullet. Moving on to sheep. So main uses for sheep, of course, are meat, wool or hair, and then again, weed control. Using sheep and goats for weed control is becoming a very, popular thing in different parts of Pennsylvania and the United States for that matter. So sheep are ruminants, but again, their biology is just a little bit different than our goats and our cattle. So sheep have thin, cleft lips. So you can see in this picture here how that sheep has a cleft in its lip, and that cleft allows them to eat closer to the ground. And they're going to use their tongue in the same manner as cows, but they're able to get much closer and get more of that grass and forage into their mouth than our beef cattle are, just because of the biology of their face. Sheep are classified into large, medium, and small breeds. And so, these two pictures of sheep here would be considered larger breeds. And then that top picture is a medium breed. That would be a merino sheep, which is primarily raised for its wool. And then the lower picture is a Cheviot. And so again, that's just a smaller breed of sheep. They have their uses in different parts and places of the world. And so you can see that, really the breeds differ, average weight. A large breed is 95 pounds as a lamb, and the smaller breed is 45 pounds. And so understanding the difference in the types of breeds and the size of those breeds is important when we're doing, nutrient management planning or 590 planning or manure management planning, because our standard weights vary so much across the different types of breeds. Just a couple different words to remember or consider when we're thinking about sheep. So docking or dock. Docking is the humane shortening of a sheep tail to protect the health and hygiene of the sheep and the herd. This is a practice that is fairly common across the sheep industry. A wether, again, is going to be a castrated male sheep, and mutton is the term used to describe meat from a sheep older than 12 months. So we use lamb to describe sheep, the meat from sheep that are younger than 12 months, and mutton to describe the meat from sheep that are older than 12 months. Which brings me to our last category of livestock here in Pennsylvania that we're going to talk about today, which is swine. Sometimes these are also called pigs. So you'll hear both swine or pigs used. And main uses of, our swine is meat, lard, and then again, byproducts. And so swine are monogastrics, just like us. And so they are very inefficient grazers. They do not have the digestive system to really adequately break down forages and grasses and get the appropriate amount of nutrients out of them. And so they are better suited for, grains and proteins that are provided to them, in a more of a confinement system. Swine weights range from, 35 pounds as a baby nursery pig. So a piglet or a nursery pig would be a baby. Then we move up to our wean to finish. So a wean to finish category is going to be when a piglet is, weaned from its mother and it goes to one facility and it is raised from, that weaning age to slaughter in one location. So wean to finish. But we may also see grow to finish. And so grow to finish is when the piglet that has been weaned has been, fed and raised for a few more weeks in one location, and then it goes to another location to finish out. So grow to finish is just a slightly different category. You'll hear talking about gestating sow. So that would be any female that is pregnant. She is currently pregnant or going to be pregnant, but she is used really for production of babies. And then we have sow and litter. So the sow is the word for a female pig. And then a litter, of course, is what a group of the little babies are called. So whenever they're together, they weigh a certain weight. And then boar is, of course, a male. And in this picture here, I thought this was interesting. So this is a boar. His name is Sasquatch. You can see that on the shirts behind him. And he weighed 1,012 pounds this past August at the Iowa State Fair Big Boar competition. And so standard weights are helpful, but they are not always accurate. And so you can see here the standard weight for a boar is 450 pounds, but this guy here is more than twice that in weight. So it's important to, talk with your producers and really get an understanding of the breed of animals that they are using and the weights of those animals, because our standard weights are not always going to be accurate. So just a few more terms related to swine. So you may hear the word barrow. A barrow is a castrated male. A dam is going to be a female parent. A sire is going to be the male parent. A gilt is a young female that hasn't given birth yet. Farrowing is the birthing of a litter of pigs. And sometimes people will call it a farrowing building or a farrowing barn. And so that's going to be that area of a farm where the females are giving birth. And then, of course, we use pork to define our swine meat. And so all of the standard weights that I pulled off today, I will put these links in the chat when I'm done with my presentation, but the standard weights come from the Penn State Extension Agronomy Facts 54. It's a fact sheet, and this fact sheet can also be found in Supplement 5 in the Act 38 Technical Manual. So that's where all of those standard weights that I talked about today come from. Additionally, if you're looking for information on manure production and average nutrients in the manure, and again, these book values are useful for a new operation or if you're just trying to get a plan written for a farm, but honestly, the best thing to do is to have records and to do manure sampling so you know exactly what percentage of nutrients are in the manure there at the farm, because there is so much variability. But these numbers can be found in your agronomy guide if you happen to have an agronomy guide in front of you. I think you'll be getting an agronomy guide at boot camp, but they are on page 48 in the agronomy guide, or you can also find them in the Act 38 technical manual. And, really just a few things to think about when we're talking about livestock. Livestock are helpful or useful, I should say, because we can use them on less productive lands. So a lot of times, we might not be able to, grow corn, soybeans, hay on a chunk of land, but we can grow pasture. And so that's a great place that we can put our livestock. Livestock are also very adaptable. If you think about where livestock are raised around the world, they are raised essentially in every climate, elevation, landscape. They're very adaptable. It does take a little bit of, selection of breeding, but they are very adaptable. Livestock is a great way for a farmer to diversify their operation. whether they have a variety of different types of livestock, or they're just adding on livestock as just an extra thing on, as part of their farm. With our ever-changing markets, it's always nice to have a little bit of diversification. Manure is always a complicated thing to think about. There are pros and cons of having manure. It's very beneficial when we're putting it out at the proper rates on our fields, so we don't have to be purchasing fertilizer. But if we have too much manure and nowhere for it to go, we can definitely face some problems. Livestock, we want to consider the environmental impact of having livestock. Are they creating animal concentration areas? So we need to, install a heavy use area to prevent erosion and nutrients from running off into our water. So, we want to think about those things, but livestock are also great grazers, and they help with carbon sequestration, and they convert things that we can't eat into things that we can eat, which is wonderful. And then market trends, the demands, the types of food, the things that producers want the things that consumers want will affect the way a, livestock operation is run. If we think about lamb meat right now, about 60% of the lamb meat that's consumed in the United States is imported. So we may see, the production of lamb increase across the United States to try and make up for that huge import gap that we currently have right now. And so, any type of veterinary advice that may have been given it's just for educational purposes. Please, seek the advice of a licensed doctor or veterinary medical professional if you have any questions. And with that, I'll take any questions if there are any.
All right. Thank you so much, Jenny. That was great presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, so if there are no other questions, we will continue on with an introduction to pasture management with Leanna Dubstadt.
Okay, let me bring up my screen here. Get this flip-flopped. All right.
You're good. Yep, you look good. Yep.
Okay, sounds good. All right. Hi, everybody. Like Chris said, my name is Leanna Dubstadt. I am an agronomy educator based in Bedford County, and I work with South Central Pennsylvania. My background is in animal science and agronomy, and so it's actually really nice to be able to mesh these two things together. So I love working with pastures and talking with producers about them and their livestock and all that good stuff. So this will be good. Here's that veterinary disclaimer that Jenny just showed, so I won't dwell on that. So I'm going to start in a very similar way and just ask, what is pasture? We know what hay fields are because another way to grow forages, but our pastures is going to be that land that we have covered with grass that is suitable for grazing animals. And so I'll dive into that a little bit more about that suitability part as we move along here. But some of the really good benefits about pasture compared to having hay ground will be things like improved soil nutrient contents and soil health, reduced soil erosion from rainfall and runoff because we have that perennial growth all the time, reduced potential for flooding because we've got that root system that's there to help absorb any of that excess water that might be coming in, prevention and spread of invasive plants. And that's simply by having those grass species there to dominate the area and smother out anything that might be trying to come in, essentially. Reduced energy use, and that's through the means of using our livestock to harvest those forages for us. So instead of having to go out and get the mower out, run the tedder, run the rake, bale it, move the bales to store them, deliver the bales to take them out to anywhere to feedlot to feed the cows or anything like that. there's that reduced energy use part of it, as well as being able to have some of those nutrients kind of brought back into the system on a continual basis through the use of manure, having to use less fertilizers, maybe some less herbicides, because we are maintaining those productive forages, which are smothering out any of our weeds that might be present, all that good stuff. Increased diversity of plants and animals. So most of our pasture systems, as opposed to hay fields or any of our row crops, they're going to be have multiple species. They're not going to be that monoculture of just growing wheat or just growing corn or just orchard grass. It's going to be that nice diverse mixture of different grass species, different legumes, maybe some forbs will be in there if we've got sheep and goats in the system, things like that. And then also providing food and recreational areas can be kind of used as a multi-use space. So within a pasture, there are a lot of different components, different areas that can be talked about. So first of all, the main portion of this is the plant composition. So majority of the time in Pennsylvania, we have cool season perennials as our main pasture component, and that's anything like our orchard grass, tall fescue, Kentucky bluegrass, things like that. And then that can also include our legumes. So any of our clovers that we might put in there, alfalfa, if that's something a producer is interested in, bird's foot trefoil, things like that. So that can vary depending on what type of livestock that you happen to have and what the producer or farmer is really looking for out of their pasture system. And then, of course, the livestock species, which Jenny talked about. So that can vary across any of the farms. They could also have multiple species on one property, and those will be managed slightly differently in the way that they move them through a grazing system. And of course, we have our fencing and our gates. So this is what makes it a lot different as well from our hay production systems, is having to incorporate these fencings, the fencing. So this would include exterior fencing as well as any interior fencing for rotation management. Water, and this could be man-made or utilizing ponds, springs, streams, and then of course any of their designated crossing areas, and I'll dive into that a little more in a bit. Supplemental feeding areas, so if they're providing any sort of grain, or at any point in time if we need to feed hay, whether that's in the winter time or at the peak of summer, there's going to be designated areas to be able to do that. The location of minerals, loafing areas, which will be just in general, that's just an area that the livestock like to hang around in during the day, a lot of times during the heat of the day. And this will be a lot near trees because they're looking for shade, near gates because sometimes they want rotated or moved to a next pasture, so they'll hang out near a gate, or sometimes near the water areas as well. There may also be stabilized areas within the pasture, and this could be walkways where you utilize those areas to move livestock from one paddock to another or get them up to the barn or anything like that, as well as maybe any heavy use areas. So maybe you have a stabilized pad specifically for feeding, or something around where your water is, things like that. Sacrifice lots, and I'll talk about that a little more. And then sometimes wooded or shade areas are also encompassed in some of our pasture areas, particularly in our continuously grazed areas. A lot of times those are slowly being fenced off as we develop grazing plans and things like that. So those are our main components. Diving a little more into the specific pasture spaces. So we've got that main grazing area where we would have vegetation year round. And I put year round in quotes because we live in Pennsylvania and it is not quite possible to graze for the entire year. We do reach a point here where our cool season perennials just, they go dormant for the winter. And so we run out of forage eventually. Some producers are very efficient and can go for almost the entire year, up to about 10-ish months, depending if they do any sort of stockpiling of grasses that can be grazed further into the winter, or if they provide additional annual forages, so maybe some cool season annuals to try and graze a little bit longer into the year or really early in the spring. So like right now, some producers maybe in the southeast portion of the state might be grazing already, whereas some of us more in the northern tier or up in the mountains, it's still just a little too cold and our grasses are just starting to break dormancy, so we don't want to get them out there just yet because we could damage that new growth that's trying to come up. So that's when I say year-round is as far as we can get it for grazing. Those sacrifice lots that I mentioned, so this would be a short-term area that livestock are kept. And this could be during periods of poor weather, maybe that point in time in the summer when we happen to run out of pasture because it's too dry and our grasses aren't producing like we want them to. So we pull them off to an area that we're going to sacrifice. They're going to beat it up a little bit. We're going to feed them there. And then when we get that regrowth coming out, we can move them back out to some of our main grazing areas. But we're going to restore that sacrifice lot to its original condition and reseed it after that event happens. And then lastly, our animal concentration areas or heavy use areas. So these are those areas kind of like that top picture there. Brown, incapable of producing forages. You've got livestock there very, very often. There's going to be a heavy concentration of nutrients there because that's where they spend a decent amount of time. This tends to be an area kind of close to the barn. Maybe they're brought in at night, or this also could be sort of like your sacrifice area where that's where you put them during periods of inclement weather. But you're not going to restore that area. It's going to be your heavy use area. So we've got all those different parts, and so we want to make sure we're matching those needs together between our plants and our livestock and also our fencing. So those first three things I talked about kind of can get grouped together in how we need to match them all. And so I already mentioned our plants, like our cool season perennial grasses, which is typically the main component of our pasture systems. Some warm season annual grasses might be grown by a producer. This would be things like our sorghum sudan grasses, millets, things like that a producer can grow in its own separate paddock, and livestock can come through and graze that during the peak of summer when our cool season perennials have gone through they're in a semi-dormancy because it's just too hot for them to grow at that period of time. And so they'll utilize that to kind of extend their grazing season. Legumes, any of our clovers, alfalfas, things like that, and forbs, which would be any of our woodier, bushy type species that may be used if goats are in the system. They may just be there because they're an invasive or a weed that just happens to be in the pasture system that they're working through on getting cleaned up as well. And then we're going to match those plants with our livestock. So cattle could be dairy or beef, horses, sheep and goats, llamas and alpacas, swine, which aren't typically used for grazing, but are sometimes out on a pasture system, and chickens as well. So if we're talking about our cattle, any of our cool seasons working really well for them, maybe utilizing some of the warm seasons. For the forbs, that would be more of our sheep and goats. They're those browsers that don't mind, like Jenny said, going up and nibbling off of leaves on bushes and trees. So that would be utilized more for them. Our livestock, our horses, they're not really or our cattle and our horses aren't really going to touch those. And so just understanding what species are going to work best. You can think about other things, preferences. So Jenny talked about this right at the end of her presentation where livestock can kind of be trained for certain things. So understanding their preferences of what was there when you started. So when you start incorporating new species, it may be a learning curve for them on wanting to eat it or knowing what it is. It could take them some time. Fescue is one that we talk about a lot where there are livestock out there that it's not their favorite thing to eat, but if you've kind of adapted them to graze it, they'll get the hang of it eventually. It just depends on your particular operation. And then we want to match our livestock with our fencing as well. So some cattle, even horses, can be in barbed wire situations if that's what they were raised on the entire time. They're respectful of those fences as long as there is plenty of forage available the entire time, not typically too much of an issue. High tensile fencing might be needed for some of your cattle or any of these species. Number of strands would depend on how pushy your livestock are, maybe how close you are to a housing development or main roads, things like that. You may even move and do some page wire or some woven wire, which is that fencing that has a bunch of those squares all attached together. Those work really well for sheep and goats who kind of like to sneak through the fences. So really just understanding how your livestock are handled. And this fencing may change too throughout a pasture system. So you may have high tensile out on the range or out far away, but as you move closer to maybe your handling facilities, that may change to board fences or that page wire, so that they're less likely to push out because you're moving them to do some sort of handling with them. Watering systems. So this could be a new source that was man-made, or you can use an existing water source that's there, like a spring development or anything like that. A lot of times stabilized stream crossings will be involved, preventing that loafing area or preventing them from loafing in the water themselves, and also helping with stabilizing stream banks. They can be spring developments, pressurized systems. You can utilize electric pumps if you have the electricity available, or you may need to move to some sort of solar system or gravity fed if you're in an area of the farm that doesn't have any electricity. These can be permanent troughs, like these pictures here that I just popped up. So there's a concrete trough there, or a rubber tote that has a float system, but you've got those barriers around it, so that's a permanent space. Or you may have the main picture there, where's the rubber bin that you can move from space to space with the hoses that are laid out. So maybe permanent, maybe movable. You may have above ground lines, above ground hoses, or you may have them buried underneath frost as a frost-free method. The size of the tanks will vary depending on how many cows you have, or how many, I work with cows a lot, so that comes out. How many animals you have on pasture in that particular paddock at one period of time, and making sure that you have enough water available that if a large number of the animals are thirsty at once and come through and try and drink out of the tank, understanding how big your tank should be depending on the number of animals you have. Riparian buffers, they're not just for cropland or conventional farming, work really well in pasture systems. They help to kind of square off areas, which can be helpful to prevent corners that livestock could want to loaf in, or when you're trying to move them that they could get kind of stuck in. So a really nice way to square those off. But on top of that, our riparian buffers doing well for filtering runoff, capturing sediment and nutrients that may flow, because of course we're in pasture systems, so manure is just part of the system. Being able to capture any of that nutrients that may run off, preventing stream bank erosion because you don't have livestock, you have a designated crossing area like the picture on the bottom. Livestock aren't able to go wherever they want and break down that stream bank. So helps to keep that nice and stabilized. You can incorporate trees in that for extra stabilization. And also prevention of the introduction of fecal bacteria if you've got livestock that want to loaf in that area, especially during the heat of summer, just kind of keeps them from being able to do that. And that's also a nice way too, where you can have these stream crossings if the producer happens to still want to use that stream as a water source for the livestock, so that they still have access to it, but it's very minimized. So to stabilize or not to stabilize really depends on producer preference on whether they want to create a stabilized area for locations that they want to be permanent, or we can rotate those items around to try and prevent some of these dirt areas. Really just depends on how seriously the producer wants to be about having nothing but forages all over the place, or if they want to have those permanent areas. It also involves some more work on their end if they want to rotate these items around the pasture. So moving into some strategies for grazing. So the whole point in implementing a grazing system is we want to maintain an optimum height of those forages. We care about their ability to grow and produce. This also involves nutrient management, so any applied fertilizers, looking at manure distribution, the nutrient considerations of the livestock themselves, And so we're going to do that with some managed grazing that I'll talk about here in a minute. Another thing that's a benefit for us is building soil organic matter, maintaining that constant vegetative cover, constant roots. So we always say that what we see above ground is reflected below ground. So maintaining that optimum sward height, that's why that's important. Because if we're constantly grazing our forages down to that really short height there in our continuous systems on the right, our root systems are also very, very short. It limits the grass's ability to scavenge for nutrients or scavenge for water. And so that's why we want those higher stubble heights, so not overgrazing. It also reduces those wet and muddy areas, like I had mentioned earlier, because they're able to soak up more of that water that may be coming into the system. So the benefits of managed grazing, you can look at this chart as on the left-hand side, we've got residue heights of 6, 3, and 1.5 inches. And you can see that for those 6 and 3 inch heights, we're able to get, I'll grab my laser pointer here. For those 6 and 3 inch heights, we're able to get 6 grazing events, whereas for the 1.5 inch height, we're only able to get 4 because those grasses just aren't able to regrow quickly enough to be able to get more grazing events. And you can also see that's reflected in the yield that we get. And you might say right here that, well, that 1.5 inch height gave us more pounds of forage per acre. Well, yes, but we were able to get less grazing events. And so here's those numbers here multiplied by the number of grazing events we were able to get. And you can see here that, yes, it's still more than this 6 and this 3 here being optimal. So that's why we usually say 3 to 4 inches of stubble height. But this is important here for this video here, and hopefully this plays for you. And so this is a very short video here of orchard grass that has been cut to 1 inch on the left and 3.5 inches on the right. This is 5 days of growth and how quickly it's able to regrow. And so you can see just how much faster that higher stubble height is able to regrow. So every time you're grazing or mowing too short, you're removing photosynthetic area that plant needs to be able to regrow and replenish any nutrient reserves. And so you can understand that this batch over here, it's going to grow back a lot slower. You're not going to be able to graze it as often. And eventually you're going to deplete those nutrient reserves so much because it's just not able to keep up with that constant clipping that it's not going to persist as long as you want it to. And so we can see that reflected here as well, same heights as before, in how quickly we're able to get back on the following year as well. So being how early in the season you're able to start grazing. So this spring time frame of whenever you're able to start grazing, the higher the stubble height, the earlier in the year you're able to start grazing because that grass is able to grow back that much faster. And so we talk about this too with looking at quantity versus quality. And so this is with any of our forages, so hay or pasture production. So we've got this early vegetative, real leafy, really nutrient dense period of time. And as our forages start to mature, the dry matter goes up, but so does the fiber and the lignin, which is not as good of quality. It gets real stemmy. Whereas down here, we're more leafy, higher protein, higher digestible nutrients. And so looking for this point in time here where those things intersect, where that crosses, so that you can maximize on the quantity that's available, but also letting your livestock graze the highest quality forage that you can. So managed grazing, I've mentioned that a few times. This is simply controlling when and where livestock are consuming pasture. So benefits of this is it reduces selective grazing. So livestock inherently will go through and pick the species that they want to eat the most. It's kind of like us at a buffet. You're going to go out and you're going to pick all the best things that you like. And then you're going to, as things start to dwindle down, you'll come back through and eat the stuff that's not so great. But that really hurts the livestock in terms of quality, like I had just mentioned, because if they go through and graze all that stuff that's real lush and new, by the time they start to come back, that what's left has gotten more mature, And so they're not grazing a consistent quality of product that way. Managed grazing also helps us with more even manure distribution, parasite reduction, increasing our stocking rates and carrying capacities, and able to improve stand longevity. So this is what I mean by managed grazing. So continuous stocking, this is not a managed grazing system. This is simply having an external fence and allowing our livestock to graze wherever they want to in that area. Now we could start to manage it a little bit by temporarily fencing off sections during periods of surplus growth. So this may be in the springtime, whenever the grasses are just growing too fast for our livestock to be able to eat it. And then rotational grazing, this is when that managed grazing really starts to come in. So we still have this exterior fencing here, but we've now subdivided it into different areas, and we're going to rotate them around through these paddocks, allowing each one of these areas to rest and regrow before bringing livestock back into it. And then strip grazing is very similar, a lot of times used more often for our warm season annuals, for grazing those, grazing corn stalks, any of our stockpiled grazing. So this is where you're putting in temporary fencing here and moving them one strip at a time. You may or may not be utilizing back fencing if you're wanting to graze again. And so if you're doing this early enough in the year where maybe your sorghum Sudan grass will regrow, you will want to put a back fencing up to prevent them from going backwards and grazing new growth. You want them to stay in their little lane, essentially. Whereas maybe if you're grazing stockpiled tall fescue in the fall or winter, that's not going to regrow because it's too cold anyway. So you may be able to forego the back fencing. So maybe in some systems you only have one water source. Pastures don't have to be square, but you can try and make them the same size because that helps you with understanding timing of your rotation. The overall goal here just being pasture rest and allowing us to have some stand persistence. Utilizing one water source for multiple paddocks whenever you can, especially when you're setting up a new system. So that previous picture may be in a scenario where that's what's existing on the farmer's property already, and they want to be able to utilize that water source. So making it work for them. Whereas if you're setting up a water source, putting it in a more centralized location so that when you start subdividing paddocks, it makes more sense and that you can use one water for multiple spaces. Setting up rotational fencing, we're going to think about that location of water that I just mentioned. Think about the movement of animals and how they naturally move so that you can allocate where your alleyways will go. Maybe you already have a continuous system and you can see a defined pathway that livestock take up and down a hill or something like that. Don't go against that because that's where they're naturally going to want to walk anyway. So putting alleyways in those areas, paying attention to your access of a sacrifice lot, considering paddock shape and size. So I said paddocks don't need to be square, but you do want to think about the price of fencing and taking that into consideration. Working with this 4-to-1 ratio here, because as you can see, here's that 4-to-1 ratio. We've got 64 square feet in both of these areas, but this top one here is going to require 40 feet of fence, whereas this bottom one here is going to require 68 feet of fence simply because of this extra long side here. So keeping those in mind and really utilizing that temporary fencing. So not having quite as much permanent fencing so that you have more ability to adapt from year to year. Target grazing. So this is trying to eliminate that spot grazing or trying to eliminate these dirt spaces that you see here. And so basically what will happen with this is, so you've got a tree that you can't necessarily move, but you've got this feed bunk here. That maybe you feed grain, maybe this is a hay ring, something like that. Maybe it's a mineral tub, but moving that around the pasture system so that you can pull animals to different areas of the pasture and keep them, because they're going to want to hang out here where the water or the tree is. So getting them to utilize this area better is kind of the goal of target grazing, or if your water is mobile, moving that around as well. So we want to work on maintaining optimal stocking rates. So understanding exactly how much space your animals need based on their body size, like Jenny talked about, which would indicate roughly how much they're going to consume on a regular basis. We want to have enough that we're utilizing our forages efficiently and not too low that we're going to end up with some of that spot grazing that I talked about and actual underutilization. So underutilizing forages can be just as detrimental as overutilizing it. So here we just have really poor forage production because our stocking rates are too high, whereas here our stocking rates are so low that they just can't maintain those heights, and so weeds are able to pop up and start to take over the system. So some common grazing mistakes are grazing pastures too close, rotating animals too quickly, not allowing enough time for regrowth, like that 6 to 8 inch range, or that, so allowing them to get up to that height before moving them back in, and removing interior fences, allowing animals to clean up pastures. This is really common in the fall and through the winter months, just kind of giving them the run of the area, but we want to try and keep ourselves from doing that. Pinch points can be a problem. These are probably areas of stabilization that need done. Alleys, gates, entrances to barns and paddocks. The problem with this is you end up with this mud situation, which can become a livestock and a resource concern. Pastures will still need to be maintained, so overseeding our pastures. If stands are thin, we can do this with broadcasting or frost seeding, most often done in that period of time where it's freezing overnight and thawing during the day. That's what frost seeding is. And we're going to do that more often with some of our legumes, maybe timothy, because those seeds are really small and round. Some of our grasses, it's a little bit more difficult to do that. It's more common to drill them in. Grasses don't always want to fill in those bare areas if you have any, so we want to make sure we're maintaining proper fertility. That's kind of our first step here. Pastures can be a top producing crop on the farm, but they kind of get left on the back burner compared to our row crops or even our hay fields. But they can really do a lot for us if we pay attention to our fertility. So doing soil tests to help us reduce over applications, which can be expensive, environmental hazards, and just more work for producers in general. And then under application or neglecting our pastures can diminish their growth. We'll get decreased stand persistence, reduced livestock gains because our forage quality is just not where we want it to be. And here's that nutrient distribution that I was kind of talking about a little bit. So down here on the bottom is where our waterers are. And up here at the top are where some of our trees are located. So you can see the density of nutrients and how high it is right next to our waterers and right next to our tree. And it's very uneven and spotty. So here's some really thin nutrient areas. And so that's where that target grazing or moving things around to try and capture the nutrients into those areas as well. Dragging can help in this manure distribution, breaks down those manure piles, helps with parasite control. And pasture fertility is not a closed loop system like some people want to think. Only 80% of that nutrients gets returned on the pasture through manure, which makes sense because our livestock are taking in that forage and they need to utilize those nutrients as well for their own growth and production. We can get that nutrient return to be higher if outside feed is brought in, and that's anything like bringing in outside grain for them to eat while they're on pasture, or feeding them hay on pasture, so like bale grazing or having a bale ring out there. That can bring more nutrients into the system that way. Rotational grazing alone cannot sustain stand persistence, so we have to maintain that fertility. We can incorporate legumes if a producer is interested in that. Having 30% legumes can help provide that nitrogen input that you want. We have to make sure that they're properly inoculated, and choosing the best species for the operation, how you manage your grazing, what livestock you happen to have, things like that. So yes. And then the last thing involved with pasture management is weed management. So for every pound of weeds present in pastures, desirable forages can be reduced by almost 2 pounds. And if I think about this, the best way to visualize it is whenever you have like a thistle plant out there, that surface area that it takes up, it's got grass growing underneath of it, but it's branched out so much, livestock aren't going to stick their noses in there. And so it may be 1 pound of weeds, but it's taking up 2 pounds of desirable forage space because livestock aren't going to stick their noses in there near the thistle. So that's where that amount comes in. So the solution to this is some managed grazing. Up here, we've got our continuous system. You can see spot grazing is happening. Weeds are allowed to pop up. It's very uneven in its grazing pattern. Whereas our continuous over here, so the cattle are over here on this side, you can see it's been much more evenly grazed off, real level. And the nice thing about this is that you still then have that nice even regrowth on the other side, less weed densities, and they're going to be moved into this pasture this day, and they're going to have this nice high quality forage over here. Whereas over here, they're left with some of this taller stuff that's a little more mature. It's going to be a lower quality. And so some things that we saw in research that was done at the university was exactly that. You see these overgrazed areas in the red circles, weeds popping up in the yellow circles. And we saw certain things start to increase or decrease in those pasture systems simply because of that. I don't want to dwell on this too much because I know I'm close to time. And then lastly, other weed management things, mechanical and spraying, along with our rotational systems, which can be used as kind of that cultural method. So utilizing those first and then spraying as like our last resort. And then just to wrap it up, the goal of pastures is we want to have productive forages that can persist, provide high quality feed for our livestock that our livestock is able to harvest for us, require less inputs, so fertilizers, herbicides. We won't have to overseed as often because we've got these nice persistent stands, and then reduce or eliminate any resource concerns because we have that constant perennial ground cover. And then lastly, there's never a one size fits all solution. We have to tailor our grazing management strategies and our pasture management strategies to the production themselves and understand the producer's goals, management goals that they have to try and make it work for them, because what worked for the neighboring farmer may not work for this particular one. So keeping that in mind. And then I might not have time for questions, but that's what I have for today. So thank you.
Thank you, Leanna. We can take a few questions if anybody has any, or you can put them in the chat. I can also provide Leanna's email. If you have questions, you can email her directly.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you to all the presenters this morning. I think we're going to take about a 15-minute break. Tim, if you want to put the timer up, that would be great. And we'll
Sure
be
thing.
back around 10 o'clock for survey basics.
Just going to give it 2 more minutes to let people trickle back in and give us the full 15 minutes. So we'll get rolling in about 2 minutes. All right, welcome back from break. I hope that was refreshing for everyone. I just wanted to put a plug in for another training. I know Ginny put the Act 38 website in the chat, and there is a course, ACA and Manure Storage, and part of that ACA and Manure Storage courses, or most of the courses, looking at ACA areas, animal concentration areas, and determining if they are inadequate practices or resource concerns, and then talking about ways to address it, whether that be through different management or different pasture management, or whether a actual structure, heavy use area needs to be constructed. And so a really good course that would tie nicely into some of the talks that have happened today. But we're transitioning now to a new topic, survey basics. And I'd like to introduce Jared Boger. Jared Boger is a civil engineering technician out of the NRCS state office, and he heads the survey training and survey management for NRCS, and he also is our CAD coordinator. So that ties together nicely, those two items. But Jared, with that, I'm going to hand it over. Go ahead and tell us about survey basics. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Just hopefully sound check. Everybody hear me okay?
You sound good, Jared.
All right, thanks. So survey basics. This is not something that is learned in one day or 1 year or 5 years. This is learned throughout your career. I've been doing surveying for probably 16 years now, and every day I still learn something new. And so if you leave today thinking you're going to be an expert today, it's probably not going to happen, but we're going to try our best. So surveying is only learned effectively through actually practice in the field. Okay. These references here, they're good references. Engineering Field Handbook, Chapter 1 on surveying, technical release number 62s on engineering layout notes and staking and calculations. And then National Engineering Manual, Part 544 deals with the equipment. This is all good material to review prior to you surveying at any time. It's there to look at. Okay, so surveying, it's the science of art between which lines, distances, and angles and elevations are established. Plane surveying, it's assumed that the Earth is flat. We all know that's not the case, but typically we use the plane surveying for smaller areas, and we'll learn some of these, but the laser level and a B2A are actually survey equipment that we can use for that. Geodetic, it's for larger surveys. geodetic is essentially the Earth's curvature, and we use GPS, which would be global positioning systems, to perform these type of surveys. Topographic, these shows relative elevations, depths, contour lines, and this all can be achieved through any type of survey equipment. Topographic is the most widely used type of surveying that we do here at NRCS or even across the board. Engineering is used for construction checks. Engineering is widely used for determining post-construction elevations, as-built, and this typically can be used with any equipment with our day-to-day work. Aerial is use of aircraft equipment to generate a picture from above. Not much used in Pennsylvania, but across other agencies and also private firms, they do use this. Okay, here we survey to determine locations. We surveyed in the field to determine locations of suitable practices, directions, how the water flows across landscape areas, parcels, fencing, slopes, rise, overrun. I know you guys were learning about waterways, waterways, terraces, and diversions, and then volumes, determining cut and fill for topsoil. When we're doing these types of surveys, we like to theoretically put them on a graph or a design. So once this is all complete, we can put together diagrams, maps, profiles, cross sections, and then also design work. Here's a few types of survey equipment. Up in the left-hand side there is a hand level. Let me turn on my laser pointer. Here's your hand level. These are lasers. These are laser levels. Here's a climometer, and down here there's a self-leveling, which is a B2A, and then total stations and GPS equipment. All these can be used to survey some of our conservation work. We will have a field exercise coming up here in a couple of weeks. What you'll see there is going to be the laser level and the self-leveling level, or quote unquote the B2A. These are some of the accessories. We have a tripod. These will put equipment on, such as your total station or your lasers or your B2As. Here are different types of rods. There's a 25-foot rod there. There's a what they call direct rod or quote unquote Lanker rod. Here's a prism you typically use for robotic total stations or total stations, climometer. And then up here on the right-hand side is a GPS data collector. Measuring horizontal distance. Pacing, we can use pacing. I'm not sure if you guys learn your pacing yet, but I think you guys do that in boot camp. We do taping. We use a wheel. We use a stadia. We use truck or ATV measuring devices, handheld devices, and then also aerial photography. So it's really important. It's really important to take care of your equipment, right? First, it's expensive. Second, if somebody else wants to use it and they go in there and sit and try to take it out and survey and it's not working, that kind of causes a problem. So a few things: transporting equipment, keep secure in vehicles, make sure they're in rods or in cases, and then also protect them from weather. Adjustments and calibrations should be done with an engineer or a technician that has done it before. some of these should be adjusted once a year, once a year, or every other year, to make sure that they are operating correctly. Maintenance, make sure you clean your equipment. Always have extra batteries. And there is mistakes that happen, but just got to let somebody know. And then storage, make sure they're dry, make sure it's locked, and make sure that all those latches are secure on your truck beds if you have any cases there. Down there on the left-hand side here, those are some of the references for those few items here. Okay, so this is a 25-foot rod that's measured in hundredths. It's measured in hundredths, tenths, and foot. I will show you. Let's move to the next one here quick. So how do you read this? So this is an example. If this is 7 foot on the rod and you're reading here, this is essentially 7.67. A lot of this this may be not familiar, but we're gonna work through this with the field stations in a couple of weeks. But we will learn this on site. But here are instructions how to actually read the rod. Here's a few key terminologies. Benchmark. It's a point of known or assumed permanent elevation. Typically, benchmarks are determined prior to taking any topographic survey points. That's the first thing that we establish. Backsight is a rod reading on a point of known elevation, and it's the first shot taken after an instrument setup. Height of instrument is a line of sight elevation. It is determined by adding the backsight to your actual benchmark. Foresight, or also they call it a side shot, is a rod reading taken on any point which elevation is to be determined. These are the shots that you're going. These elevations are going to be. These are the elevations that are determined and going to be used for your design work. Turning point, it's which elevation is determined by processing of leveling, but is no longer needed. So what that means is a turning point is considered a temporary survey point. Let's just say, for example, if you're doing a total station survey and you can't get a prism reading because it's your partner's behind a building, you need to do a turning point to shoot him behind the building. And like I said, some of these, we're going to go through a lot of these during our field exercises. This is just instructions on how to establish your height of instruments and your backsights. So if we have an elevation of 100 and we take a backsight at 5.26 to get our instrument height, we have to add those two together. So it would be 100, elevation of 100 plus 5.26, and that's going to equal your 105.26. Okay. And then when I said that every shot after that is your FS, which is your foresight or quote unquote side shot, you're going to need to minus those elevation or that shot from your actual instrument height. Let's keep on moving here. We will go through this again when we get up to the infield class. We'll run through a whole example before we even go out into the field to learn how to do this. Survey note keeping. A few things here. We need to make sure it's accuracy needs to be sufficient, needs to be legible, and then clarity. So if somebody else wants to come in and needs to take a look at your survey book, they need to make sure that they understand what you actually surveyed and understand it. So I don't know if I have enough, but I'll bring some to our class. But these are example cover sheets of what I use out in the field. We'll fill these out when we start surveying. This is our survey notebook. This is essentially a cover sheet here. Usually here you fill out you fill out your field office, your date, your project name, whoever's surveying, what kind of conservation practice you're surveying that day, what the purpose of the survey is, like if you're doing a design survey, if you're doing a construction check, if you're doing a final survey for an as-built checkout, a little sketch of what the area looks like, and then a legal description. I usually, if I put anything down here, I'm usually putting in northern and eastern. And then up here on the right here, I usually put in the type of equipment that I'm going to be using, and then also the your initials. This is just an example of, over here is your profile page, and this is your cross-section page. A lot of this here on this side, you're going to have your station, and you're going to have your back site, which was determined prior to surveying, and then you have your height of instrument, and then you also have your land elevation. And when I say 100, just to make sure, just to clarify this, when I say elevation 100 is an assumed elevation. Okay, it's an assumed elevation. It's not real world like a GPS survey. If we're doing a GPS survey, the elevation are real world. They're true. But if we're doing a lot of our surveys include assumed elevations. If we're doing for example, let's just say a waterway, and we're going to assume a benchmark of 100. Okay, our work is going to be based on that elevation. Okay, it's relative to that. It's relative to that site, just that site specifically. Okay. Over here, we want to put, so you have your cover sheet, then you have your profile page, and then you have your cross section. It's nice to put in your what you're doing that day, and the practice that you're doing, and then also your surveyors and your okay. So here are your stations. Here is our assumed elevation reference to that site only. And here's our back site, and then our instrument height, and then our assumed elevation, like I just discussed there. For our example that we had before, so we're gonna take, to determine our instrument height, we're going to take 100 plus our 5.21, and that is that's our instrument height that we're going to work off of. Typically for rough survey rod readings, we want to round up to the nearest tenth. This is kind of a diagram of the example that I'm going to show here. We have our elevation over here. We have our instrument height set up. And this red line is considered our height of instrument. So like I said before, you take 100 plus your 5.2, and you're going to read 105.2 across here. Now, look at the blue line here and see how it's working its way down. Just remember that. Foresights, FS. Okay, so these stations, okay, so these stations start at 0 plus, let's just say, for example, we're doing a waterway. We're going to start at 0 plus 0, 0. Usually that is at the bottom of the hill. Okay, we're going to work our way up. Okay, so we're going to start at 100, and then we're going to pace, or we're going to use our wheel. We could use a tape. Okay, and then we're going to take elevation, or we're going to take grade broad readings at each one of these stations. Okay, and that's going to be our survey that we're going, or those elevations are going to be our points that we're going to design off of. So we're going to take the instrument height minus your foresight, okay, and our elevation at station 0 plus 0, 0 is going to equal 98.9. Okay, you see benchmark 1 down here. This is actually a benchmark check. So essentially, at the end of your survey, you'll come back and hit your assumed elevation of 100 at the end of the survey to see if there's any discrepancies within your survey. Okay, that's just a check to make sure nothing went haywire during your survey. So this is your diagram. Okay, so each one of these is your foresight. Okay, so remember our elevation or our height of instrument was 105.2. Okay, if we go back to our notes, look at our notes here. Okay, these were all subtracted. These foresights were all subtracted from 105.2. Okay, and then that illustrates our diagram here. It's also important for whenever you're filling out your notebook here. If you have your elevation of 100, you always want to put whatever that elevation is. Okay, so for this example, we took a shot on a 5/8 inch diameter rebar. Okay, and that on top of that 5/8 diameter rebar, that assumed elevation is 100. And it's nice to make sure that you mark that in your book here. Also, for this example, this shot was near an existing water well, and then so forth down here. And you can see with this example, whoever did this survey went back and took a shot on the 5/8 inch diameter rebar from before. Turning points, like we said before, this is really hard to actually explain through a presentation. I haven't found the best way to do it. So we are going to skip this, and we're going to talk about it in our field exercises. I just don't want to confuse you anymore. But just it's in there to take a reference or take a look at it and try to process it. And then when we get out in the field in a few weeks, we can talk about it. Okay, we're almost done here. Keynotes. You're developing field notes for someone so that someone not involved in a survey can read. We talked about that for clarity purposes before. Referencing survey material in the future. So as a surveyor, and I go and read somebody else's survey book, I want to make sure that I understand what they're doing and what's going on there. Third point there, this has never happened to me personally, but it may become a legal document or evidence. I haven't had that happen to me. Not to say it won't. We'll hope not. But a little comment down there. It says, "Take pride in your work and do it correctly." So just have pride in it and do it and make it look pretty. A few things here before we move on here. Common errors during survey: reading the wrong crosshairs, rod not extended up correctly. I'll explain this a little bit in the field when we're using those rods, transposing numbers or breaking down your design notes. Rod not plumb. Equipment we talked about needs to be calibrated, and if it's not, it can prevent it could consider some errors. And then reading your wrong benchmark. Not sure if you guys have it, but this would be for our field exercises in a couple weeks. This will be up here in Lewisburg, and these will be our stations. And I think that's it.
All right. Thank you, Jared.
Have any questions? I'll be here for a little bit.
Any questions for Jared? Okay, we'll take a deeper dive when we get into person here in Lewisburg, and we'll be able to experience what it's like to actually use some of this equipment. So, great.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Jared. Next up, we have Jenny on a biosecurity deep dive, how to keep animals and yourself and everybody else safe on the farm. Jenny?
Thanks, Chris. Hello, everyone. I'm back. And just to be clear, my name is not Rob Minen, but Rob Minen has given this talk in the past. And so he wasn't able to be here today with other commitments. So I'm going to give Rob's biosecurity for on-farm visitors presentation. So just a little bit of background on biosecurity. The poultry and swine industries have been very aggressive with biosecurity. They're something that, very important to them, because of historical avian flu with the poultry, and then the pork quality assurance program makes sure that the swine industry is keeping up with their biosecurity. Dairy, cattle industry, sheep and goats has been historically somewhat lax, but there's been a lot of focus lately on biosecurity management. And so it's becoming something that is much more important and something that we know is necessary on all operations. So you've probably heard in the news last year, there was a lot of talk in 2023 about the highly pathogenic avian influenza. And so, in February of 2023, about 58 million birds were affected, and there were cases confirmed in a variety of different states across the United States. And then, as we continued throughout the year, infestation seems to decline as birds are not moving as much, into those summer months. The wild birds that are carriers of HPAI aren't migrating as much. So there's still a problem, but, a little bit less detection happening. And then I just looked this morning. And so currently right now, because we haven't really gotten, it's not as prolific out there right now. There's been less activity in commercial flocks as of right now with HPAI. And it could just be that we're getting better at it, at making sure we're not, contaminating things, or it could just be that it's, going through its pathology cycle and we're not seeing it as much. But also in the news, there were two reports. This one was yesterday, came out of, I think, the Minnesota Department of Health. saying that a goat tested positive for avian influenza. And then also another report today from the USDA that it has been confirmed in dairy cows across Texas and Kansas. But what, something that's very interesting is that mammals are dead-end hosts of HPAI. So that means when a mammal contact is not the word. What am I looking for? I can't come up with the right word. Contracts. Thank you. Yes. Good job. Teamwork today. When an animal contracts HPAI, when a mammal contracts it, it will not actually spread that to other mammals. And so this happens because there were, infected poultry or wild birds on these operations. And so what was very interesting, the Minnesota Board of Health said at the end, and that's kind of why I've set up all of this, is that biosecurity is the first line of defense for anyone to protect their animals from diseases. And this includes simple measures like cleaning equipment and housing regularly. And so that is really why we are here, and what we are going to be talking about today is biosecurity and why it is so important. So, in the context of animal agriculture, biosecurity is a series of management steps taken to prevent the introduction of infectious agents into a herd or flock. These steps do not have to be complicated to work, but they do need to make some sort of biological sense. And so you want to make sure you know what questions to ask when you are scheduling farm visits. And so sometimes farms require, appointments only. You want to have that conversation ahead of time with that farmer, knowing what their protocols are. They may have protocols in place, and if they don't, we're going to cover best practices for biosecurity, later on in this presentation. And so infectious diseases and viruses can be spread through a variety of different organic fluids. So manure, urine, exhaled air, milk, blood, you get the point. Just like when we have a cold or a flu, we can spread these diseases and viruses in the same way, not these ones specifically, but you get the point. Diseases and viruses are spread essentially in the same way. And so those sources can be spread by direct contact. So, animal to animal, that can cause that spread, but it also can happen by contaminated carriers, or this fancy word for contaminated carriers, which is fomites. And I just find this word to be very interesting, that fomites is the word that is used for contaminated carriers. And so animals and people and other, rodents, birds and flies, these are all living things that are living and breathing that can be carriers. But also we need to think about non-living things like equipment and water and air and feed as also carriers. But probably the main carriers that we're concerned about are going to be things related to manure and mud on our equipment and on ourselves. And so there's two types of biosecurity. There's structural biosecurity. So this is when we're keeping our poultry, for example, in a building that has walls and doors. And so we're keeping them out, physically separated from us. So there is a barrier there. And then there's operational biosecurity. So these are going to be practices, policies, and procedures that need to be followed. And this is something that, can be enforced or introduced by the operation that you're visiting, but it can also be your personal practices and policies and procedures, or your place of works procedures for when you are doing farm visits. So a line of separation is really an area that you should not enter. So farms will have certain areas that really should only be used by farm staff and not people outside of the farm. So you can see in this map down here, you can see the red area that's outlining. I'm going to assume those are either poultry or swine barns. And so those, visitors are not to be, crossing those barriers into those facilities. That is a line of separation. And so we want to treat that line basically as a wall, so nothing crosses that without following those biosecurity protocols. And so our goal really is to keep the animals and farm separate from outside risk. So anything that is on that farm, we want to keep it separate from outside risks, and realizing, of course, that every farm can be different. And so that's why having just a basic understanding of those best practices can really set you up for success. So as an agricultural professional, that is visiting farms, there are some key responsibilities that we have. Not only do we need to be kind of an educator, so we need to have knowledge about livestock diseases and prevention procedures. You don't need to be an expert, but just be aware that they are a thing and that they exist, and what, can we do to prevent that. Also, you want to serve as a source of information. If you don't know that information, we can provide you some, tools and some websites and some links to help you, even if you're just passing those things on to others. And of course, we want to be a role model in practicing our biosecurity protocols. It's really essential to, be doing the best that we can in our biosecurity protocols that we have. When I was in college, I worked at the Penn State Dairy Farm. And since I was, I had a pair of boots that stayed at the farm. And so then if I was doing farm visits for a class or a field trip, I would wear a different pair of boots, but I kept my boots separate since I was always at the dairy farm working multiple times a week. It was just easier to keep a pair of boots there just for that farm. So I didn't have to keep cleaning them all the time if I was going to other farms for, classwork and stuff. And then also we want to be supporters of biosecurity. We want to make sure we're learning each farm's biosecurity and what their expectations and guidelines are, and that we're willingly following what is asked of us on each farm. And so something we need to consider is how can we break the spread of disease? And so downtime is really important. So this is following any required time away from other animals. And so standard operating procedure would be 72 hours of downtime between sites of similar species. So if you're going to a dairy farm, you're going to wait about 72 hours before you go to another dairy farm, if possible. And of course, if the farm that you're visiting requires longer downtime, then you need to be following their requested downtime. And then exposure. We want to always follow our cleaning and disinfecting protocols, and pre-plan farm movements based on if there is a known animal health status whenever possible. So if you know that you're going to an operation that maybe has some sort of disease or an outbreak, make sure that might be that last farm that you visit in your day, if possible. So cleaning and disinfecting is really where everything starts at. And it's simple. We want to make sure we're removing our organic matter. Our disinfectants only work on our clean surfaces. And so, of course, I feel like I'm doing a pesticide talk right now, because we have to make sure that we're reading and following our label instructions. And if you've ever been to a pesticide meeting, you know that that's something that is said all the time. So with our disinfectants, again, they work on clean surfaces, and we want to make sure that we're reading and following those labeled instructions. And so disinfection and cleaning is kind of the baseline of all of our biosecurity. And so if we're going to a farm, we want to make sure, first of all, if we can, that we've obtained permission to visit that farm and make an appointment. I know sometimes that doesn't always work, but if possible, make that appointment and visit one farm per day. This will allow really for you to start each farm visit with, a new set of clothes, things that are clean. It allows your boots to dry out in between washings and everything like that. You want to ask the farmer or the producer if they have specific biosecurity procedures. And so a lot of swine operations will require visitors to have not been at a swine operation in the last, 1 to 3 days. Some farms will have tire and vehicle wash stations. They'll have designated parking. know exactly what facilities you can enter and what not, where you should meet the farmer, and what clothing and footwear might be required. And you may also want to explain to them, to that producer, that farmer that you're visiting with, what your biosecurity procedures are. Some operations, and I feel that this is probably more relevant to swine and poultry operations, but they will require personal protective equipment. So things like disposable booties and coveralls, face masks, hair nets, and gloves. This is not something that we're going to experience at every farm visit. And a lot of times, if we're not going into the facilities, into those buildings where those animals are housed, you're not going to need to wear all of that personal protective equipment. But again, if the farm requires it, then for you to do your job, then that's what you need to be wearing. It's best if you travel with a bucket, a brush, and some sort of disinfectant and some water, and a clean garbage bag. And if you are able to leave that garbage bag of your booties or anything that you may have had on that is disposable, if you're able to leave it at the farm, that's a good thing, because then you're not taking that dirty material with you. But sometimes that's not something that is acceptable. So then you must take it with you, and you want to, again, keep it kind of separate in your vehicle away from your clean material, so you're not contaminating your personal protective equipment. So when you get to the farm, you want to be wearing some sort of rubber boots, preferably something that is easily washed. And so you can see in that bottom picture, there's an image of an individual wearing rubber boots. Those are really convenient. Or you can get some sort of disposable plastic boots that you would then take off. You want to wear clean clothing every day. And again, coveralls and disposable coveralls, masks, and hairnets are something that can be helpful. And if the farm requires it, that's great. But if you are not really interacting with the animals, just as long as you're showing up in clean clothing, that will be great. And again, rubber boots are key. And then foot wash, it's convenient to have a bucket or a large tub, some sort of boot, brush, disinfectant, and soap, and a water supply. And then, of course, you're going to need trash bags and possibly some hand care. I would recommend hand sanitizer. Disposable gloves are an option, and even disposable wipes. And so when you get to the farm, you want to make sure that your vehicle is clean from, a previous visit. If you had to go through mud or manure at a previous farm visit, make sure you run that vehicle through a car wash to get that organic matter off of your vehicle. Pay attention to where you're parking. If hopefully there's a designated area. If there is not a designated parking area, look for as clean of a site as possible. Again, you have to consider safety. If it's possible, to pull off the road, but not actually into a field where manure has been spread, that would be best case scenario. We don't want to be driving through the facilities or livestock traffic areas. Again, picking up any of that fresh manure, we don't want to be doing that. We want to follow all warning signs, and if possible, meet the farmer in a low risk area. So somewhere like an office or an other, non-animal area. And if you're, having trouble getting hold of that farmer, hopefully you have a phone number on hand so you don't have to go walking around the whole operation looking for the individual that you are supposed to meet with. So when you get to the farm, hopefully you have clothes on. It does say put on clothing and footwear. I'm hopeful that you've showed up at the farm with clothing and footwear on, but you want to wash those rubber boots in a disinfectant solution or put on those disposable plastic boot covers. If you need to be wearing disposable coveralls, put those on. You want to make sure that any material that you're carrying onto the farm, such as your papers, notebooks, notepad, computer, phone, any sampling equipment, is clean and free of any organic matter, so things like mud and manure. And if you do use equipment that's been in contact with animals, feed, or manure, make sure that you're disinfecting it before and after use. So, for example, if you are doing manure sampling and you're taking a bucket with you from farm to farm. You want to make sure that that bucket is clean and disinfected before and after collecting those manure samples. During your visit on the farm, you want to try to avoid entering facilities and livestock areas unless absolutely necessary. And so for the majority of our time on a farm, we don't really need to enter those areas. But when Jared was giving his talk on surveying, it kind of made me think, there are times when doing surveying for a project that you are going to have to walk through areas where the livestock are, and you're going to be taking that equipment. So we want to make sure that at the end of the day that we are cleaning and disinfecting that equipment and getting all of that organic material off of our surveying equipment and of course our shoes. We want to minimize animal contact unless absolutely necessary. Again, if you can avoid walking through those high-risk areas, manure and other organic matter material areas and feed areas, those are going to be high-risk areas. We want to try to think clean to dirty. So, our young animals tend to have less diseases than our older adults. So we want to start with, if we have to, we're doing visits, start with those young animals and then move to the adults. Again, same thing, healthy animals to sick animals. Let the producer direct the order of the animal visit, but don't be afraid to suggest, hey, why don't we start with the calves before we go check out the dry cow lot or the mature cows. If you are doing multiple farm visits in one day, we want to do low risk to high risk. So, if your first visit is just stopping in, talking to the farmer, maybe he has to sign something in the office, that's a very low risk farm visit. So you could do that first. And then, towards the end of the day, if that's when you've got to be surveying for a heavy use area in an animal concentration area where you're going to be, walking through manure and using your equipment in the manure and the mud, that would be a high risk visit. And so that would be something that you would want to save for the end of the day, if possible. Operations that have mixed species, of course, are going to require a little bit of special consideration and planning because you may need to avoid all farms after visiting one farm if it's got a lot of different livestock on it. And we want, of course, want to communicate with all parties involved in multiple day farm visits because they may have concerns that you didn't think about with you visiting different operations in one day. When you're getting ready to leave, you want to wash your boots in disinfectant solution. And really the key is to remove all of that organic matter. So you want to get any of that mud or manure that is stuck to your boots off. If you've worn plastic boots, you want to place them in the trash bag and hopefully leave that at the farm if that's possible. If not, and you're taking it with you, make sure that you're keeping it separate from your clean equipment and try to keep it from contaminating your whole vehicle. And of course, you want to wash your hands with hand sanitizer if possible, or maybe you can actually do hot water and soap if you're at an operation that allows that. And we want to be disinfecting our equipment. And so, you can use that disinfectant solution and that brush from our boots on some of your surveying equipment. But also, if, for example, you had a clipboard with you and a cow licked it because cows like to lick things. And so, I recommend carrying some sort of disinfecting wipes. You could wipe down any of that equipment that you can't really scrub with a brush. And then if possible, you want to clean your vehicle for the next farm visit. This may not be necessary if you didn't go through mud or manure, but if you did, if there's a car wash nearby, that might be a good option, especially if the farm doesn't have a place to do a tire wash. So realizing that there is no perfect disinfectant, we want to hopefully find a disinfectant that's effective against pathogens. It's going to help remove dirt and manure. It's going to decrease, that damage to clothing and equipment, and is not super expensive, but still at the same time, something that is user friendly. So it's kind of a balance that find something that works for you and does the things that you need it to do. Some challenges are that disinfectants are sometimes inactivated by organic material. So think about dirt and manure. So we may need to give our boots a little bit of an extra scrub, get the stuff off first with some soap and then hit it with maybe a spray disinfectant. So we've removed that organic matter and now we've disinfected. Some of our commercial products will actually require an extended time of exposure. So they might actually require things be soaked in that disinfectant for 10 minutes or more. And this is not very practical, especially when going from farm to farm. So make sure that you're reading the label before you purchase that disinfectant and knowing exactly how it's supposed to be used, because we don't want something that we're going to have to let our product sit in for 10 minutes. That's just not practical. We want our surfaces to dry thoroughly between farm visits, and research has shown that the most important thing is to get your boots clean. And so that's really, the biggest thing is making sure that we are cleaning our boots, we're getting that mud and manure off, and we're allowing things to dry between our farm visits. So a few resources for biosecurity. I will put these in the chat once I'm finished here, but the Penn State Extension does have some information on biosecurity. The National Agricultural Biosecurity Center has a link, and then the University of Vermont has a whole website on healthy agriculture related directly to biosecurity. And so biosecurity measures are fairly basic and common sense. The goal really is to show up at the operation with clean boots, give them a wash, disinfect them to be sure. And then at the end of that time, that visit, remove any organic matter, mud, manure, whatever that is on those boots and disinfect. Try to eliminate or reduce your direct contact with the livestock as much as possible. I'm a sucker for scratching a cow's head. I grew up on a farm, and it's something that I am working on, as part of my biosecurity protocols, is not to touch the animals, because it's not a good practice. It's something I enjoy, but I know that it's not a good practice. And so I try to make sure I don't do those things. We want to make sure we're always communicating with farmers, co-workers, anyone else that might be coming with us on that farm visit. And biosecurity really needs to become a part of our routine whenever we are visiting farms. And Rob, if you know Rob Minen, he has a good sense of humor. And so biosecurity should become a habit, just like washing your hands before dinner. So we always want to make sure that we show up at places with clean hands, clean clothes, and clean shoes and equipment. So with that, I will take any questions.
Thanks, Jenny. One thing I just wanted to add real quick, there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There were 6 counties that were added in 2023 for spotted lanternfly quarantine. Just to keep in mind, if you are traveling from county to county, there's also a protocol to make sure that your vehicle is as clean as you can make it, to keep spotted lanternfly out of the quarantine areas. The northern tier of Pennsylvania still is not in a quarantine. So if you are traveling into one of those areas, you should probably, there is a training that Penn State Extension has through PDA to kind of make yourself aware of how to keep your vehicles clean if you're traveling in and out of a quarantine area.
That's a really good point, Chris. I've done that training. It's not very hard, but really it's just about, checking your vehicle, make sure you're not carrying any hitchhikers with you, and if you've been parked for a long time, looking to see that any egg masses haven't been laid on the car, and that's in that August through October timeframe.
And one other thing I'll add, when we go to boot camp in person, we'll be providing biosecurity scrub in, scrub out. So you'll have an opportunity to do that. I would highly recommend that you wear full rubber boots when we go farm to farm. And that way you can get yourself cleaned up before we go to the next farm.
Yes, perfect. Good call on the full rubber boots.
Muck boots are okay. Leather boots, really not. So, all right. Any other questions? Okay, next up is Katie Brooks. She's going to talk about an introduction to fish and wildlife conservation practices. Katie, are you? Yep, there you are.
Yep, I'm here.
All right, great.
I will get my presentation pulled up. Are you seeing the main screen or are you seeing my notes?
Nope, we can see your main screen. It looks like
Okay.
presentation mode. Yep.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so yeah, my name is Katie Brooks. I'm a forestry and wildlife educator with Penn State Extension. I'm based in our McKean County office. So Chris was just talking about, the northern tier of Pennsylvania. We do not have spotted lanternfly up here yet, but that's where I'm located out of our Smethport office. My phone number and email are there. If you think of any questions after today later, I think I'm the last presentation before lunch, so I'm sure people want to be getting to that. But if you think of anything later, feel free to reach out and get a hold of me, and I'll have all this information at the end as well. So my talk today is an introduction to fish and wildlife, and how we can start thinking about that when we're thinking about farms and agricultural systems. So the objectives for this talk are to talk about why fish and wildlife need to be considered in conservation planning, and to begin to look at our viewpoint of the agricultural landscape and see how these different systems of wildlife and agriculture can kind of start to work together. I'm going to try to show that it's not as complicated as it may sound. So just like any resource, our value of it depends on our viewpoint or importance of that resource. So a lot of my work, I work with forest landowners, and for them, a lot of times wildlife is one of their top values. When we start working with a landowner, when they have questions, we ask them, what are the really important things to you? What has the highest value to you? And for a lot of them, wildlife does have high value, but that just depends on an individual's viewpoint. There may be farmers or even forest landowners who wildlife is not a high value. So if it's something that's not a high value, why should we even think about it on a farm if it's not one of the objectives or not something that they place a lot of value on? And the answer to that question is that we have to consider wildlife because it's a public resource. So the same that water and air are things we have to consider because of their public value, we also have to consider fish and wildlife. And that's just because of the history of our country, which I'm going to get into a little bit now. So before the colonization of North America, the British model of wildlife ownership was limited to the king having full ownership of all living wildlife. And so in Europe, everything from the land, the crops, livestock, trees, and wild game were property of the landowner. And that was only done if the king granted those rights, actually. So the king could grant rights to hunting, to the land, to fishing, to the people of his choosing at his will. The king would even gift these rights to individuals other than the landowner in certain situations. So even because you owned the land, you weren't necessarily the one controlling all the things on it. So in essence, the king would manage all natural resources and wildlife for the people and remain the only one to own the rights in that system. So later on, North America decided to handle wildlife ownership much differently than it had been done in Europe. In this case, we don't have a monarch to own all of the land and all of the natural resources. And at first, when North America was new, before we were even a country, there was kind of a take what we want mindset. And the North American settlers, kind of used up as much as they could, really thought that there were endless resources, endless amounts of wildlife here. And so we really just took whatever we wanted, and that did lead to the extinction of some of our wildlife species. So later, we kind of reevaluated how we had been taking and using whatever we wanted, and the mindset kind of shifted to a good for all mentality as we saw the impacts to different wildlife populations. So now in North America, wildlife is held in public trust, and states act as the managerial trustees for the public. And this is actually known as the North American model of wildlife. It's studied as a model and has been implemented in other places as well. So for Pennsylvania specifically, in the Environmental Rights Amendment in Article 1, Section 27 of the Pennsylvania Constitution, It says that Pennsylvania's public natural resources are the common property of all people, including the generations yet to come. And as a trustee of these resources, the Commonwealth shall conserve and maintain them for the benefit of all the people. So as a result, we have a ton of different laws that oversee fish and wildlife, in addition to a lot of our water and air acts and policies. We also have policies that oversee fish and wildlife as a public resource. So state and federal agencies must always consider these laws whenever we're doing any kind of management, not just when it's a cooperator's choice. And I should have mentioned this on the last page or on the last slide, but in Pennsylvania, we have the Game Commission and the Fish and Boat Commission, and those are kind of our public trustees that manage the resources for the good of Pennsylvanians. So here's a few examples of some resource concerns when landowner and the laws may not always have the same objective. So a good example is when we talk about manure. In this example, the farmer says they need to spread manure because their pit is full, but the law says you can't spread manure at certain times because we're protecting water quality and we're protecting the public benefit. Another example would be wetlands. Historically, we did drain wetlands to get more land to graze or use for crops, and then laws were created to protect wetland functions because of the public benefits that they provide for water quality, infiltration, and flood control. So just like water and air, we have to consider fish and wildlife because it is a public resource, it's publicly owned, and we have to do whatever we can for the public benefit of the use of wildlife. So farmland wildlife does not include every species of wildlife in Pennsylvania. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is really going to focus on the benefits to those species that we see primarily on farmlands. The species that we do see a lot on farmland are wildlife that lives in open, non-forested areas. So sometimes we would think of them as maybe field specialists, edge specialists. A lot of times will be found in farmland. So those are really the species we're going to focus on, not our, forest interior species. These farmland wildlife species include some of the fastest declining wildlife groups nationally, which are grassland birds. So some species have seen a 60% decline over the last 40 years. And so that's why it's even more important to talk about them because they have seen such drastic declines. So why is farmland wildlife declining? We have to look at it two main reasons why. So there are natural occurrences and then the unnatural or man-made occurrences for wildlife decline. Predators and disease are natural occurrences. So in Pennsylvania, historically, wolves and mountain lions would have been our primary predators, but now we have things like coyotes, foxes, birds of prey that are natural predators, as well as humans to some extent for some species. So primarily when we're thinking about our game species, we're the main predator for them. Diseases are also natural control, things like chronic wasting disease when we talk about deer, avian influenza for birds. And those predators and diseases are natural. They're always commonly occurring things that decrease or control wildlife populations. So when we talk about unnatural occurrences, this is large-scale habitat loss and also the use of pesticides are our main two unnatural declines. So I'm sure everyone has heard about the bald eagle decline in the 1960s from the use of DDT, but if you're not familiar, they were poisoned with DDT when they ate contaminated fish, and then that chemical DDT interfered with the ability of the birds to produce strong eggshells. As a result, their eggs had shells so thin that they often broke during incubation or otherwise just failed to hatch. So the banning of that pesticide helped the eagle population to rebound. And that's an example of an unnatural decline due to pesticides that we did thankfully find a way to combat. And then for large-scale habitat loss, we have things like land clearing and development are a large part of those declines. So predator-prey relationships are pretty common in ecology and biology, and sometimes we term this the hawks and foxes syndrome. These are just predator-prey relationships or cycles where populations go up and down naturally. So a prey species may decline for some reason, such as a normal disease outbreak, lack of food, bad weather affecting reproduction, things like that. So we have a low or we have a decline in prey species, and then because of that, we'll see a tailing effect of a decline in our predator populations. But then when we see an increase in prey populations, our predator populations will increase as well. So it's a directly related relationship. The predation on prey species is normal, typically won't cause a decline in our prey species unless there's something else wrong. So unless we're combining predation with things like loss of habitat or a new or novel disease that they've never encountered before. And another thing to remember is that predators are wildlife too. A lot of times they get a bad rap for causing the decline. Coyotes are often cited as a reason for, lack of deer or something, and that's typically not the case. They kind of get a bad rap for that, but they are wildlife too, and we can manage habitat for them as well. So then onto our other natural cause of decline, which is diseases. These are things like rabies, highly pathogenic avian influenza, chronic wasting disease, West Nile virus are some of the ones we're commonly hearing about. And these actually have less effect on wildlife than commonly believed. Of course, if we're talking about something like chronic wasting disease, that's new and novel in an area, but things that have been around for a while don't have the major effects that we see when diseases get into our domesticated animals. And that's just because wildlife has more natural tolerance or immunity. When we have diseases on farms, we see an issue with things like poultry flocks and the avian influenza. It affects all the birds because they're all in one small area. But in most cases for wildlife, they're more dispersed, so there's less transmission. So even if we do have a highly deadly disease, it's not getting spread quite as quickly as it is in our domesticated populations because we have less transmission. So, and then we can also think about things like rabies. There's positive reports of rabies relatively frequently, but we're not seeing major declines in our wildlife populations from it. It doesn't cause any widespread decline. It's not transmitting rapidly, and that's just due to their natural immunity as well as their dispersal between groups. So then going back to this, next we're going to really focus on the unnatural declines because those are some of the things we can control a little bit better. So typically pesticides are not directly killing wildlife, but it's affecting the plants or insects that they're feeding on. So pesticides kill plants or insects, and that in turn reduces food resources. So that's one way that is an indirect effect on wildlife. And then it also is able to, a lot of times pesticides are able to absorb into plants or insects that are feeding on the affected vegetation or insects, and it transfers to other animals then, and that's called bioaccumulation. So kind of the movement of the pesticide up the food chain where it's accumulating in animals that are eating a lot of these treated pests. So these issues with pesticides are not typically widespread. They're very localized, obviously, to the area where the pesticide is being applied, and it affects just a few individuals at a time, typically. And we can really easily control these issues by following label restrictions, using pesticides and herbicides in the way that they're recommended on the container, consistent with label restrictions, and just by regulating the use and how much of them we apply, we're able to control a lot of the detrimental effects to wildlife. So really, what it really comes down to for farmland wildlife decline are the large-scale habitat loss. Certainly those other things are concerns, and when you combine things like diseases and pesticides and predators with large-scale habitat loss, you do see a decline in wildlife, but it's really the large-scale habitat loss that's the one that we're most able to control. And it's probably the number one reason why we're losing those farmland wildlife. So all wildlife need food and cover and water, and they need all three of these they're all equally important. Typically in Pennsylvania, water is readily available and not limiting. So when we're talking about resource concerns for wildlife, we're really just going to talk about food and cover. So the limited availability of food and cover is why we see large-scale migrations of birds of prey and songbirds in the fall. Their food resources decrease due to seasonality, and so they go places where food is readily available, like the tropics, which is where many of our species migrate to. So then when food starts to become more available in the spring and summer, they'll start to migrate back. And it's not just food, cover is seasonally unavailable for some species as well. So we need to think about having all of them locally available throughout the entire year for species that don't migrate, either our resident songbirds or just other wildlife species that are remaining here throughout the year. So this is a chart of the different resources available throughout the seasons. We have water, indicated by the blue line, food is the black line, and then cover is our green line. So like I said on the last slide, water isn't a limiting factor in PA. We can see with that blue line, water staying above that 50 mark throughout the entire year, winter to fall. And when you get into the fall and winter, you can see food and cover decline, which is, again, what's causing a lot of those species to migrate to where those resources are available. And so when we think about the availability of resources throughout the year, even things like a harvested crop field has more cover sometimes than others. So between September and October, maybe the fodder on a field has started to decay or been chopped away or removed from the field. So that's a loss of food and cover as well, even though it's, in the same season. In fall, month to month, availability may change. So when we're talking about wildlife vegetation, habitat is the key. Vegetation is food and cover. It's the protection from predation. It's a place to have a nest, to raise their young, to protect their young from predators. So a lot of our wildlife practices focus on habitat. And so just a little more about me, my background, I actually started out wildlife and fisheries in college was what I got my degree in. And I started to realize that to really have any effect on wildlife species, I needed to learn more about forestry and about habitat. And so that's kind of how I became more, got into this position that I'm in now, and actually ended up with a master's degree in forestry because I really realized that the management of wildlife is really focused on habitat. So there's a saying that habitat isn't everything, it's the only thing. So if wildlife don't have habitat, they won't survive, they'll move elsewhere. And so it's really the only part of wildlife that we have control over from a landowner, a land manager, farmer perspective. So it's really the part of wildlife management that we control. So what do we do on farmland to impact vegetation? How can we manage for wildlife and the conservation practices that we typically use? Some options, things like crop rotation are great for both food and cover. Crop residues are great for food and cover crops, food plots and harvest, all are great for food and cover for wildlife. And then we have practices like long-term vegetation, buffers, and also interspersions, so kind of breaking up the habitat, are also really important cover parts of wildlife habitat. And so part of evaluating wildlife habitat includes looking at the distance to the cover, how large the field is, where uninterrupted cover occurs on a field. So lots of different things to factor in when we're looking at food and cover availability. So getting into each of those a little bit more, when we're looking at crop rotations, a more diverse rotation is always going to be better for wildlife. So the greater number of different species, the better. Diversity is really, really key when we're thinking about wildlife. If there's cover crops, the more time that there's cover on the ground, the better that it is for wildlife. When there's increased cover, there's also increased food availability as well. So like I have here, food sources are more than just the crops. You have things like insects, which are a really important part of our food web. I think it's something like 90% of songbirds rear their young on insects, or caterpillars even more specifically. So just having the cover there that's going to provide the home and the food for those insects is really important. And then we can talk about crop residues, which are important for soil health and erosion. So things that farmers may already be considering and practices they may already be doing for other reasons are really important for wildlife as well. So retaining some cover for winter, as well as food sources for animals that don't migrate or hibernate and then have to find food over winter. So it's a great use for that as well. So we have things like horn larks and other grassland winter birds coming through and foraging in these low crop residues throughout the winter. And then cover crops, they're great for all sorts of reasons. These are also, again, practices that we talk about all the time, that even when we're not talking about wildlife, and it also, provides a benefit for those wildlife reasons. So if you look at these pictures, the left versus right, obviously I don't have to elaborate on the food and cover opportunities in that right picture versus the one on the left. But it's another thing that we're probably already doing, and you can just add it as another reason for farmers to implement it as the benefit to wildlife. So then there's food plots, other cropping activities. Food plots are often a choice that people make because they're already interested in wildlife. So I work with a lot of forest landowners that are, clearing land to put food plots in because of their interest in wildlife, but it's also something that can be implemented on farms. Like I said, if that's a value that they hold for wildlife, or, they may be doing it as part of a conservation stewardship program, or just because they like to hunt or bird watch or something. And in addition to that, adjusting the cropping activities to something like a delayed harvest, or maybe not harvesting anything at all for a portion of the field. Maybe, on a field edge border, if it's a field that butts up to a forested area, that's a great place to just leave some unharvested, is a great way to provide food and habitat cover for wildlife. So this is just a quick example about some resource concerns. Like I said, I think lunch is coming up next. And there's two food options here. What would be the one that you would choose for today? So this is the only food you're eating all day, either a Pop-Tart, or you get eggs and toast for breakfast, a sub with turkey, cheese, lettuce, tomato, and then grilled chicken, potatoes, and broccoli for dinner. So which would you choose and why? And which one is going to benefit you more? If you're talking about humans' daily food, you're getting more nutrients from that variety of food. When we think about a human diet, we see that more variety of food is better for getting more nutrients. And so that's why human food pyramids or plans talk about eating a variety of foods like fruits and vegetables, proteins and carbs. And the same is true for wildlife. So a diversity of different food types and a diversity of different cover is really important for them to have all the benefits that they need. So then we talk about vegetation type, and perennial plants offer more vegetation or more benefits than annual plants. The annual plants offer more benefits than regular crops because it's long term. And typically we're going to recommend obviously native species over non-native species. So looking at warm season grasses as opposed to cool season grasses is a little more beneficial. So things like Indian grass, switchgrass, big blue stem, these are all native to Pennsylvania. So they provide more habitat for the species, number one, and they're also just what wildlife is adapted to. So you can kind of think the species that they grew up with or have adapted with because they're native. So warm season grasses are varieties. They're in active growth beginning in late spring, go dormant early fall. They might have a shorter growing season than our cool season grasses, but they provide a lot of benefits. A lot of these are bunch grasses, which are a really good cover for wildlife. It allows them to move around through them, but also provides really good cover for nesting and songbirds and upland game birds, waterfowl. Deer will also hide their fawns in these grasses as well. And then those tall stems remain through the winter if they're not cut, will provide a lot of cover for game birds, waterfowl, rabbits, and things like that. So really good option looking at our native warm season grasses. And I like to just include this slide to talk about why we talk about the benefits of, or why we always advocate for the use of native plants over non-native species. So this was, it culminated in a study being done by some researchers, but it really was started by citizen science, where they started to notice that up to a third of a bird species known as a yellow-shafted flicker or spotted with red and orange plumage, which by their name you would expect them to have yellow plumage. Originally, it was believed that it was hybridization with a western red-shafted flicker, but then some researchers started looking at it and they had this new hypothesis that the reddish hue was caused by a pigment found in the berries of different invasive shrubs, so our Tatarian and Morrow's honeysuckle. So then a professor from the National Aviary showed that when these flickers, as well as cedar waxwings, which are what's in this picture here, when they eat these berries, their feathers can take on an orange cast caused by the pigments found in the honeysuckle berries. So this pigment, which is called rhodonxanthin, is replacing the pigment that's naturally found in the native berries that they're typically eating. So you can see on the left a cedar waxwing with normal coloring. Its tail is typically more yellow. And on the right, they're the ones affected by the honeysuckle fruits are having more orangish or even up to red tails. And so they're still doing research ongoing with this, but they think that the color change may impact the way that the birds select mates. So plumage is really important for mating with birds, and so this color change may have some impact on mating. And so this just is an example to highlight why we choose native species over the non-native and to remove non-native species where possible. So then back to our different practices that we can do to benefit wildlife. We have interspersion, so having cover and not having cover. If you're a small mammal out on the field on the left and there's a hawk flying overhead, they're going to be able to see you, and there's nowhere to hide. But if you're that same small mammal in the field on the right, even though it is quite a distance to those tree patches, there are places where you can get cover and hide from predators. There are also good places to hide from the elements in the winter. When you have winter storms and things like that, the cover is helpful. There are also species that hibernate, and they hibernate not in the middle of the field in these dense covers, but in the dense covers, sorry. And we can think of something like a bog turtle. We really don't have them on cropland, but when they hibernate, they do hibernate under the roots of woody plants. So they're typically found in emergent wetlands and then hibernate under those woody plants. So it's just important to kind of have a mix of these open grassland areas and have some more long-term cover readily available. So when we think of interspersion, try to think of reducing the distance to long-term cover if possible. So another example about donuts here. If you have donuts on a table in the back of a meeting room, there's 6 donuts in the back and there are 6 hidden around the room. Which donuts will be eaten first and which ones might not be eaten and might survive the whole day. And so you would expect if people are walking into a room, they're going to eat the donuts on the plate first, as opposed to those that are hidden under the table. And so this just goes back to the more cover availability, the greater chance of survival that wildlife will have. So how do resource concerns for wildlife fit in with farming? When we talk about farmland wildlife, we have to look at the landscape. And when we're writing a conservation plan, we can start thinking about where wildlife habitat fits in with the cropping system that already exists. So we don't need to specifically set aside land for habitat, but we can instead look at where we can incorporate wildlife habitat into the system that's already existing. So where can habitat and cropping work together? It doesn't need to take over or be the primary goal of the plan, but where it can fit and where maybe are there some unused or unsuitable portions that could be better utilized as habitat. So in this picture, we can see a variety of practices. There's things like windbreaks, there's a forested riparian buffer. There might even be some wetland in some of those forested areas, maybe filter strips with perennial grass, and then also just the grass along waterways. These are all typical practices that you're already seeing in cropland system for other reasons. So for the benefits of air and water, but they're beneficial to wildlife as well. So it doesn't have to be a completely new practice. It can be things that they're already implementing, and maybe just working to expand those a little bit. So NRCS programs are often used to establish wildlife habitat in buffer situations, but they can also be used in upland grassland situations as well. And a lot of these practices, like I said, can be incorporated right into that existing crop system. So buffer strips or forested riparian buffer, these practices are very beneficial to wildlife, and they can be small commitments as well. They don't have to take up a lot of land. Obviously, farmers really want to farm as much land as they can, because that's where they make a profit. So it's really about looking at things a little differently, seeing where these habitat benefits can fit into kind of the whole system and utilizing all of the space for good in some way or another. So these are the practices that we really look for wildlife benefits. They're also affecting other things. So when we're thinking about planning crop rotation anyway for soil erosion and soil health, leaving residues for that same reason, as well as for nutrient management, protecting water quality, those are all also beneficial to wildlife. So they're things probably already discussing with farmers all the time. And so wildlife fits right in because it's not new or different, but it fits right into the practices they're already doing and things they're already thinking about. And maybe it's just, tweaking things that they're already doing. So maybe they're already doing some kind of cover crop or food plot, but getting them to use a native species for those kind of things is a great example. Then you just have to remember that the farmer's in it for profitability, so they're trying to make their business work, and that's important to keep in mind too. So it has to be just little changes, little tweaks, little added benefits that are most beneficial. So we know that these practices are good for lots of things. So if we teach them just a little bit, they'll work for wildlife too. So like I said, things like extending a cover crop, delaying mowing, making a field just a little smaller. Those things will help increase the benefit to wildlife habitat. And the big takeaway is that wildlife and agriculture doesn't have to work against each other. They really can work in sync. And especially when we think about the water and the air that we're already trying to have those public benefits, this is just another one that can be added in with wildlife. So to wrap it up, we want to understand why we have to consider fish and wildlife, and that's because it's a public resource. The state really does regulate it, and we're required by law to not cause detriment to it, just like with air and water. Then we want to understand research concerns that are important to wildlife. So food, cover, and water were the three things they need. And then to look at the agricultural landscape as an interaction of many systems that could complement each other and serve multiple purposes. So we went over a bunch of conservation practices that could be used in a conservation plan and start to think of what small changes can be done to increase wildlife habitat and diversity that work within the farm system. And so that's just the link to our extension page where we have all our forest and wildlife resources. And I can take any questions that anyone has at this time.
All right. Do we have any more questions for Katie? What about the effects of moving grazing into the forests, silver pasturing, moving out wildlife?
Yeah, so I don't have a ton of experience with silvopasturing, but I know, there are a few cases of people using it, and it really just depends on what I think what animal you're talking about. but it can be done. It just has to be the right situation, the right forest species, and the right animal as well.
And Katie, can I jump in? This is Tim Peters from NRCS. So silvopasture is a practice that is a practice that nationally NRCS has, but it's not one that's been adopted by Pennsylvania NRCS. So any NRCS people on the call, that's not a practice that we can promote or offer to producers. It's not something that Pennsylvania NRCS currently promotes. So just wanted to make that clarification for our NRCS people out there.
Yeah, thanks, Tim, because I don't know, I don't know, specifically what's being done in Pennsylvania, especially from the NRCS side. So thanks for that clarification.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? Okay, well, I think we're gonna wrap it up here in a little bit. I just wanted to put a plug out. The first day of in-person, we are going to try to set up a networking social hour. And if you're interested, you can reach out to me. We'd like to kind of get a head count of how many people would be interested in going. It's going to be somewhere in the Lewisburg area. You'll have an opportunity to kind of meet and greet and talk to people outside of the boot camp hour that we're going to be around. So I'll put my email in the chat and we can go from there. Tim?
Appreciate it, Chris. Yeah, we're going to look forward to seeing everybody in person in a couple weeks. It's fast approaching. I believe registration is 9:30 to 10. I'm talking slow as I pull up the agenda to confirm that. Yes, 9:30 to 10 at the Union County Government Building. We're going to move quickly from the Union County Government Building to a nearby park where we're going to have the surveying activity and do some opening items there. The regular meeting room at the government building is going to be in use by the county commissioners, so that kind of kicks us out a little bit early, but it's all going to work really well, and you're going to really enjoy the first day and then the full week of activities that we have planned for boot camp. So we will look forward to seeing you all. The social hour sounds awesome. We'll look forward to that too. And with that, take care. If there's any questions, give a yell to Chris or myself or Shannon, and take care until April 8th. Thanks.
Thanks a lot for participating today.